The car gave her exactly 40 seconds of warning. A low vibration through the steering wheel, a subtle wrongness in the engine's note like a singer sliding off key mid-phrase. Jasper Monroe had been driving since she was 16, and she knew the difference between road noise and a car that was about to humiliate her. So she pulled off Route 9 with her blinker on, and both hands still at 10 and 2, the way her father had taught her, before he'd done most things that fathers were supposed to do, and then stopped. She sat in the gravel shoulder for a moment and let the engine die. The hood release was under the dash to the left. She found it on the first try, got out, and stood in the September heat, looking at the engine compartment of a car that had cost more than her first apartment. The smell was wrong. Not burning exactly, but hot in a way that metal and oil weren't supposed to be hot. Jasper took out her phone. No signal, not entirely surprising given that she'd taken the back road from Annapolis because there'd been construction on the main route, and she'd made the decision quickly and without adequate research, which her assistant Renata would later describe as very much a you thing to do. Jasper. She looked up and down the road. Mostly trees. September in Maryland turned everything gold and amber and somehow still green, and it was beautiful in the way that inconvenient things often were. A quarter-mile ahead, she could see a faded green building set back from the road with two gas pumps in front that looked original to 1987 and a hand-painted sign she couldn't read at this distance. She walked. The gravel crunched under heels that had not been designed for walking on gravel, and she adjusted her stride accordingly. She'd been adjusting her stride for professional environments for 20 years. She could manage a quarter-mile of shoulder. The sign read Hale's Garage in letters that had once been red and were now a comfortable pink. Below it, smaller classics and restoration. Below that, even smaller in different handwriting, yes, we work on newer models too. The overhead door to the main bay was open. Inside a car, she recognized a 1967 Mustang in a state of dignified disassembly, sat on a lift with its hood up and its guts exposed. The concrete floor was the cleanest she'd ever seen in a garage. Not shiny clean, just clean in the way that indicated someone who respected their workspace enough to care about it. She didn't see anyone. "Hello?" she said, a sound from beneath the Mustang. Then a pair of legs in dark work pants. Then a torso. Then a man pulling himself out from under the car on a creeper with the unhurried efficiency of someone who'd been interrupted before and had long ago stopped being annoyed by it. He stood. He was tall. She registered that first because she was 5'9", and had learned to register height as practical information. Probably 6'2", 40-something. Dark hair going silver at the temples in that way that worked better on men than it had any right to. His face was angular and quiet, not handsome in a practiced way, but handsome in the way of people who weren't thinking about it. There was a smear of grease on his left forearm and a clean blue rag in his right hand, and he was already wiping his hands in the methodical way of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "Car trouble," he said. "I wouldn't be here otherwise." She hadn't meant it to sound sharp. It had sounded sharp anyway. He didn't flinch. He folded the rag and tucked it into his back pocket and looked at her with a patience that was slightly annoying. "What's it doing?" Vibration in the wheel, engine noise that wasn't right. "It smells hot." He nodded. "Year and model. 2022 Mercedes S-Class. It's about a quarter-mile back. Keys." She handed them over. He looked at the fob for a moment, not at it exactly, more through it, and then looked up at her with eyes that were dark gray and entirely unimpressed by anything she'd brought to this interaction so far, including the car. "I'll take the truck," he said. "You can wait inside. There's coffee." She did not wait inside. She walked back with him to the car because she was not a person who waited, and because the situation felt less abstract if she could watch it unfold. He drove an old F25. Oh, that ran quietly. She sat in the passenger seat with her portfolio on her lap, which she'd retrieved from the Benz, and answered 3 emails on her phone, which had found half a bar of signal since she'd moved. He didn't attempt conversation. She found this unexpectedly restful. At the car, he did a complete walk-around before he even opened the hood. He squatted and looked at the tires both sides. He crouched to examine the undercarriage from 2 angles. He ran his hand along the passenger side panel below the door and said something under his breath that she didn't catch. Then he opened the hood and stood there with his arms folded, looking at the engine the way she looked at contracts that had sections she didn't like. "Coolant leak," he said. "Small one, but it's been running hot. Also a slight misfire. Your 3rd cylinder is intermittent." Probably a coil. Can you fix it today? Coil, yes, I've got one that'll fit. Coolant leak depends on where exactly it's coming from. Could be an hour, could be 3. I have a meeting in Baltimore at 2. He looked at her, not at his watch, at her steadily for a moment. That's in 4 hours. I'm aware. Then I'll see what I can do. He hooked the car to the truck's tow hitch, with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it in the dark and the rain, and probably while exhausted, and she got in the truck's passenger seat again and checked her email again, and then because she'd done everything she could do on her phone for the moment, she put it away. How long have you had the garage? She asked. About 6 years. Before that, a beat. Different work. She let that answer stand. She'd interviewed enough people across enough conference tables to recognize the rhythm of someone who answered questions accurately while volunteering nothing additional, and she respected it as a strategy even when it made her curious. The Mustang in there, she said. 67? He glanced sideways at her. Not impressed exactly, but something shifted slightly in his expression. Yeah, you know Mustangs? My father had a 68. He was always working on it. What happened to it? He sold it when he needed the money. Then he spent years regretting it. She hadn't meant to say that second part. It had simply been there, and she'd said it, and now the information was in the truck cab between them, and she looked back out the windshield. That's the worst kind of regret, he said. Selling something you loved to solve a problem that turned out not to be permanent. She looked at him. He was watching the road. Yes? Yin, she said. Back at the garage, he put the car on a lift, and she sat in a plastic chair in the waiting area, a small room off the main bay with a coffee maker and a single bookshelf of paperbacks, and a window into the shop through which she could watch him work. She tried to do emails. She did several. Then she stopped trying and watched instead. He moved with a focused economy that she recognized as the hallmark of someone who had mastered something. Not speed, not showy precision, just the kind of efficiency that develops when you've done something long enough that your body knows the next step before your mind finishes the previous one. She'd seen it in surgeons, in architects. In a violinist she'd watched backstage once at Kennedy Center tuning before a performance. She'd never expected to see it in a mechanic, which said more about her assumptions than it did about mechanics. Her phone buzzed. Renata, any update on the car situation? Working on it, she typed back. You need me to reschedule, Halverson. Not yet. You should probably... Renata. Okay, fine. But the 3 p.m. is also in jeopardy, just so you know. Jasper put the phone face down on the arm of the chair. The mechanic, she still didn't know his name, she realized had moved to the Mustang. He was doing something with what appeared to be the fuel system, but what struck her was that he'd put on headphones. 1 earbud, not 2. The old musician's habit of staying half present to the world. He worked steadily. He was the kind of person who didn't need to be watched to stay on task, which in her experience was rarer than it should have been. She got up and walked to the doorway of the bay. Coffee's okay, she said. Thank you. He looked up and pulled the earbud out. You're welcome. What are you listening to? He held up the earbud. Beethoven, the late quartets. She stared at him. He returned her look steadily. Something wrong. No, she said. I just know. Is that the cavatina? He was quiet for a moment. Oh, 130? How do you know the cavatinas? My college roommate was a musician. She had opinions about Beethoven's late quartets, and she wasn't shy about sharing them. Did you develop opinions of your own? I developed the ability to tell a cello line from a viola line at 3 in the morning, which is a particular kind of education. He looked at her for a moment. A long moment, the kind that had weight in it. That's Opus 132 you're describing, the slow movement. She played that one a lot when she was sad. Most people do. She didn't have an answer to that, and she was comfortable not having one. She went back to her chair, and this time she didn't pick up her phone. But the coil took 40 minutes. The coolant leak was a cracked fitting that he had in stock, which turned her 3-hour worst case into an hour and 20 minutes. He told her this when he came to the doorway of the waiting room. Not from inside it, she noticed just from the frame, and she checked the time and found that she had 90 minutes before she needed to leave for Baltimore. What do I owe you? She asked. $240 for parts, 120 for labor. She handed him her card. He went to a battered terminal on the counter and ran it without comment. She signed the receipt and he handed her the keys. Should hold for now, he said. Get the full cooling system inspected before winter. The fitting I replaced was factory original. There may be others starting to go. Where would you recommend I take it? Most places will be fine, or you can bring it here. She put the keys in her bag. You're a long way from Baltimore. That's usually why people like it here. She looked at the garage, the Mustang on the lift, the clean floor, the shelf of Beethoven quartets in her mental image of a man she'd spent 2 hours watching work. I might do that, she said. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't say, call us anytime, or safe travels, or any of the things that people in service environments said to fill the end of a transaction, and she'd spent enough of her professional life trying to exit conversations that she recognized the gift of someone who simply let a conversation be over. She drove back toward Baltimore with the windows down for the first mile, letting the September air do whatever September air did. The engine ran quietly. The vibration was gone. She turned on the radio and then turned it off again. She was thinking about the way a man she didn't know had said, "That's usually why people like it here," as if he were describing not just the garage, but something about himself that he couldn't quite explain. And she was thinking about a '67 Mustang and a ceiling of Beethoven and the specific quality of attention a person could give to an engine or to a person that meant they were actually present rather than performing presence. She didn't call him intriguing. She didn't call him anything. She just drove, and she paid attention to the road, and when the spire of Baltimore appeared on the horizon, she filed the morning away with the efficient tidiness she applied to most things that didn't fit neatly into categories. She had a meeting to run. She ran the meeting perfectly. She always did. The Halverson account was a defense logistics firm trying to restructure after a failed Pentagon bid, and her company Meridian Strategy Group, where she was senior project executive and the person most responsible for its sustained profitability over the last decade, had been brought in to assess their operational structure and recommend a path forward. She'd spent 11 days in their systems before this meeting, and she knew their failure points the way she knew her own face. She delivered the assessment for 45 minutes. She answered 12 questions, 4 of which were really challenges masquerading as questions, and 2 of which were actually good questions. She accepted the 3 points she hadn't fully addressed and said so directly, which she'd learned was more disarming than defensiveness. And by the end of the meeting, the room had shifted from skeptical to engaged. On the drive back to D.C., she called Renata. How'd it go? They're in. Knew it. How's the car? Fixed. Small coolant leak and a coil issue. Where'd you end up? A garage on Route 9 outside Annapolis. One of those old places with the rusting signs. Yes, though the floor was surprisingly clean. Was the guy competent, at least? Jasper merged onto IA-95 and considered the question with more attention than it probably warranted. Yes, she said. Good. Listen, the Whitmore group pushed their Thursday meeting to Friday morning. She switched into work mode without effort because work mode was simply mode had been for most of her adult life, and by the time she reached D.C., she had processed 17 things and scheduled 4 more, and had done everything she normally did when she was driving alone, which was be efficient. She did not think about the garage again until she was in the shower at 9:30 that night, and even then she wasn't sure what she was thinking about. A man listening to Beethoven quartets with one earbud and working on a '67 Mustang. The way he'd looked at the Mercedes before he opened the hood. The specific quality of not being impressed. She turned the water up and thought about Friday's meeting instead. She went back 2 weeks later. She told herself it was practical. She told herself this while scheduling the appointment using the number on the receipt he'd printed for her. And she told herself this while driving out Route 9 on a Tuesday morning when she had 2 other things she could reasonably have done. And she told herself this while pulling into the gravel lot and noting that the overhead door was open again and the Mustang was further along than it had been. She had not called ahead for an appointment, which was not the way she handled most things. She'd simply called and said she was bringing the car in for the winter inspection she'd mentioned, and a woman's voice she didn't recognize had said, "Sure, come by Tuesday," and she'd said she would. The woman was the first person she saw inside. 50s gray-streaked hair pulled back, working at a desk in the office adjacent to the bay, with a competence that suggested she had been running this place longer than anyone would know. "Monroe," the woman said. "Yes?" "He's in the back. I'll let him know you're here. Coffee's on." She had the coffee. It was better than last time he'd gotten a different blend, or she was less distracted, or both. She looked at the Mustang through the window and saw more of it now. The engine bay was fully rebuilt. The body panels were primed. It was going to be red when it was done. She could see that in the original color under the rocker panels, the rich deep red that Mustangs had worn in 1967, like a promise, back earlier than I expected. She turned. He was in the doorway, the same position as last time frame, not room, wiping his hands with the same blue rag. Or a different blue rag. She suspected he had several. You said before winter, she said. It's almost October. Fair enough. He looked past her at the car through the window in the bay. Pull it around to the second lift when you're ready. She did. He spent 40 minutes on the cooling system and the suspension, and two things she didn't know needed looking at until he showed her. He did not explain things she already knew and did not skip things she didn't, which was a form of respect she'd encountered rarely enough to notice it when it appeared. When's it done? He said when she'd asked about the 67. I thought you'd know. He looked at her sideways. The October light came through the high bay windows and made the silver in his hair more visible. I meant the Mustang. Oh, I assumed that was your project. It is. I was asking what you thought. She looked at it. 6 weeks if you're taking your time with the paint. 8, he said. The interior's a mess. What are you doing to it? Keeping it original as possible. The engine's been rebuilt with period-correct parts where I could find them. Interior will be the black pony upholstery. It had a console shifter from the factory. Are you selling it? He was quiet for a moment, the same kind of quiet she'd noticed before, weighted and deliberate. Not sure yet. She didn't push it. She leaned against the workbench. There was a clean stretch of it. She'd noted this and looked at the car, and he stood near the lift, and they were both quiet together in a way that felt oddly companionable. What do you do? He asked. Not like making conversation. More like he'd decided it was worth asking. Project executive. My company does strategic consulting mostly for defense contractors and federal agencies. He nodded. In D.C. Georgetown office, but most of my work is in the field. You work with the Pentagon. Adjacent to it. We're brought in when the internal systems aren't working and they need an outside read. He looked at the Mustang as if thinking about something else. That sounds like a particular kind of pressure. It has its specific textures, she said. You get used to operating in rooms where everyone's watching you for a mistake. Not everyone handles that the same. No, she agreed. Some people get brittle, some people get aggressive. I tend to get very calm. That can be just as intimidating. She looked at him. He was still looking at the Mustang. There was nothing arch in it, no calculation. He'd said it the way someone says a thing that seems obvious to them, and she had the specific experience of being seen accurately by someone who wasn't trying to impress her. I know, she said. She left with the inspection completed, a written report on paper, not emailed, just handed to her, and the understanding that the car was in better shape than she'd worried. She also left with the knowledge of his name, which she'd read off the front of the report before she'd fully registered doing it. B. Hale. Not the last name, she'd known that from the sign. The initial, which added up to something, but she didn't know what. She drove back to D.C. with Beethoven on the car stereo, which she'd never done before, and arrived at her office 40 minutes later and was in a meeting within 15 minutes and did not think about B. Hale for the rest of the day. She thought about him for approximately 20 minutes before she fell asleep. She did not analyze this. She simply registered it and went to sleep. October moved the way October did when you were busy and flashes of color and schedule shifts and the particular exhaustion of a season change on top of an already loaded professional calendar. Meridian was pursuing 3 significant contracts simultaneously, and Jasper was leading 2 of them, and her day-to-day life was the kind of productive that looked like success from the outside and felt from the inside like trying to hold multiple conversations at once in a room with bad acoustics. The military contract was the largest. Whitmore Defense Systems had submitted a bid for a 10-year federal technology integration program, the kind of project that only came along every few years, and that if won would transform the company from significant to essential. Jasper had been brought in to assess their bid package and identify vulnerabilities before the formal review, and she'd found 4 things she liked and 3 things she didn't. And the 3 things were important enough that she'd told Whitmore's CEO directly, which was not what most consultants did, and was the reason Meridian kept being hired. She was in Whitmore's offices when Renata texted Armature Institute briefing moved to Friday, conflicting with Whitmore presentation prep. She stepped out of the conference room to call back. Which one can move? Renata asked. Neither. Find me time Saturday morning for Whitmore prep and tell Armature I'll join the Friday briefing by video. They won't love that. They'll manage? She glanced back through the glass at the conference room where 4 Whitmore executives were talking among themselves with the focused energy of people who'd just been told something they weren't comfortable with. Renata pull everything we have on the Armature Institute. Their board, their funding structure, their current projects. What am I looking for? I'm not sure. Send me what you find. She went back into the conference room and spent another 90 minutes telling capable people things they didn't want to hear, and they paid her for it, and she was good at it. And she drove home in the October dark with the city going amber around her, and thought about what she'd found in Whitmore's bid package that bothered her in a way she couldn't yet articulate. 3 things, and 2 of them connected in a way that might be nothing and might not be. She made herself eat dinner. She poured a glass of wine she barely tasted. She stood at the window of her Georgetown row house and looked at the street below and thought about contracts and liability clauses and the specific pattern of an omission that was careful enough to look like accident. Her phone rang. Unknown number, Maryland area code. She answered. Miss Monroe? His voice was quieter on the phone, or maybe she just heard it differently. This is Benjamin Hale, from the garage. I know who it is, she said, not unkindly. I wanted to let you know I found a small issue with the power steering fluid reservoir when I was finishing the paperwork. I should have caught it during the inspection. I'd like to look at it. No charge. She was quiet for a moment. You're calling to tell me you missed something. I'm calling to tell you I'd like to fix it. Most garages would have waited for me to bring it back with a complaint. I'm not most garages. She looked at the street. A couple was walking a dog below their breath, visible in the cool air. I appreciate that, Mr. Hale. Benjamin. I appreciate that, Benjamin. I'll bring it in Thursday if that works. Thursday's fine, same time as before. She hung up and stood at the window for a while longer. She'd had relationships with men she'd selected for compatibility, shared ambitions, mutual respect, enough common ground to make weekends reasonable, and enough separateness to make professional independence possible. She wasn't sure any of them had ever called her to tell her they'd missed something. It was a small thing. She knew it was a small thing. She went to bed and couldn't read more than a page of her book before she put it down, which had not happened to her in months. Thursday came and went, and she brought the car, and he fixed the fluid reservoir in 40 minutes, and she had coffee and read through a contract while he worked. And when she came to pay, he handed her a bill for 0, and she argued with him briefly and without conviction and lost. The inspection I did for you should have caught this, he said. That's how I run this place. Your margin isn't your problem. She took the keys. The Mustang looks good, she said, stopping at the bay door. It had paint now, the dark red she'd predicted glossy in a way that suggested it had recently been done and not yet been cleared. Is that the first color coat? Base coat. 3 more to go. He was wiping the same blue rags she'd decided they were different blue rags, but from the same pack over his hands. You know about paint stages. I know enough about most things to ask reasonable questions. He looked at her with that particular quality she'd noticed before, the steadiness of someone who wasn't performing attention. That's rarer than you'd think. She left. She drove home with the radio off. She was thinking about the way he'd said, I'm not most garages, not defensive, not boastful, just accurate. The way certain things were just statements of fact, when you'd spent enough years building something real enough that you knew it. She was also thinking about a bid package sitting in her office with 3 anomalies she hadn't been able to reconcile, and the fact that the Armature Institute had come up twice in the last 10 days in contexts that didn't immediately connect. She made herself a list when she got home. 2 lists, actually. 1 professional, 1 less so. She looked at the second list for a moment, then closed the notebook. The Armature Institute briefing was dull in the way that only federal adjacent briefings could be dull, comprehensive, necessary, and delivered by people who had long ago stopped wondering whether their slides were interesting. Jasper attended from her office via laptop, half her attention on the slides and half on the printed bid documents on her desk. Then the final slide loaded and she sat up. It was a partnership announcement. New Defense Technology Research Initiative. The Armature Institute was collaborating with a private company on a long-term federal program in exactly the space where Whitmore was bidding. The company's name was Hale Defense Technologies. She Googled it. This was not something she typically did. She had researchers for this, she had Renata for this, she had a system, but she Googled it in the moment because the name was there, and her instinct said now. What came back was a wall of articles, most of them financial press, some of them military trade publications, one of them Forbes. A company founded 12 years ago. Annual revenue that the most recent Forbes piece put in the several billion range. Board of directors, strategic partnerships, government contracts, and a founder, Benjamin Hale. There was a photo with the Forbes profile dated 4 years ago. He was in a suit. He looked exactly like himself. She stared at the photo for what was probably 30 seconds, but felt considerably longer. Then she closed the laptop and sat very still in her Georgetown office, with its art she'd chosen, and its view of the street she liked, and its careful arrangement of everything she'd assembled over 20 years of knowing exactly what she was doing. She had spent 3 sessions, 5 hours total, with the founder of a multi-billion-dollar defense technology company, and she hadn't known who he was and he hadn't told her, and they had talked about Beethoven quartets and her father's '67 Mustang, and the cost of selling something you loved to solve a problem that wasn't permanent. She opened the laptop again. The Forbes article was still there. She read it. She read the next article, and the next. The conference was in 2 days. Meridian had been invited. She had been invited to the Armature Institute's Defense Technology Symposium in Bethesda. She'd planned to send one of her senior analysts. She'd been managing 4 concurrent work streams, and the symposium had seemed like a secondary priority. She rearranged her schedule. She drove to Bethesda on a Friday morning with the temperature dropping and the last of October's color coming down from the trees and the wind, and she sat through 4 hours of presentations and panels and the particular brand of industry networking that was mostly people handing each other cards and pretending the card wasn't the point. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. She moved through the crowd the way she moved through conferences, present, attentive, calibrated, and she talked to 6 people she knew and 2 she didn't. And at 2:15 in the afternoon, she stepped into the main hall for the keynote. The moderator said the keynote speaker needed no introduction, which was always true for people who needed extensive introduction, and then he introduced Benjamin Hale, founder of Hale Defense Technologies. Former military engineer, current chair of the Armature Institute's Technology Advisory Board. He walked in from the left side of the room. She saw him immediately. The height, the silver at the temples, the suit he wore the way he wore everything, with an indifference to the fact that it was a suit, as if clothing were simply functional information. He saw her at the exact moment she saw him. The room kept moving around them, people finding seats, programs rustling the low, pre-keynote murmur of 200 professionals. And in the middle of it, Jasper Monroe and Benjamin Hale looked at each other across 40 feet of conference hall carpet. She had spent enough of her professional life controlling what her face did, that she did not think her face showed anything useful. His face showed something. She wasn't sure what. She was not accustomed to not being sure. He looked away first. He walked to the podium. She sat down. His talk was 40 minutes. She knew she would be able to tell someone the main points afterward because she had that kind of mind, the kind that processed content even when the processing center was otherwise occupied. But what she was mostly aware of during those 40 minutes was the following. He spoke the way he worked, which was without performance, and he used language precisely, and he was the kind of speaker who paused in a way that suggested he was thinking rather than a way that suggested he was remembering what came next. And there were 3 moments when something he said caused the audience to react with the surprised attention of people who hadn't expected to find themselves interested in defense procurement reform. He was very good at this. She had not expected that either. The Q&A lasted 20 minutes. She didn't ask a question. She watched the room watch him. When it was over, she moved toward the door because she had made a decision of some kind without articulating what the decision was, and then she heard his voice behind her. "Miss Monroe?" She stopped. She turned. He was 3 feet away. She hadn't heard him cross the room. He moved quietly. For a large person, she'd noticed this at the garage too. The economy of motion that came from being comfortable in your own body. "Mr. Hale," she said. A pause. A very small one. "Benjamin," he said. "Benjamin." She met his eyes. "That was a good talk. You looked like you were thinking hard through most of it. I think hard through most things. I've noticed." He held her gaze steadily. "I owe you an explanation." "You don't owe me anything." "I disagree." He glanced at the room around them, which was thinning slowly. "I didn't deceive you. But I also didn't correct an assumption, and that's close enough to the same thing that I'd like to address it." She watched him. "This can't be the right place for that conversation." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He looked at her for a moment. "There's a decent restaurant on the corner of Wilson and Maple. Not crowded at 3 on a Friday, if you have time." She should not have had time. She had a call at 4 and prep work for Monday, and a long list of things that were legitimately more pressing than a conversation she hadn't planned. "I have an hour," she said. He nodded. "That's enough to start." The restaurant was what he'd described corner booth. warm light. The kind of place that had been there long enough to know that lunch crowds and dinner crowds were different animals, and the gap between them was where the best conversations happened. She ordered black coffee. He ordered the same. The garage, he said. I started it about 6 years ago. I'm there 2 or 3 days a week depending on what's happening at the company. That's a significant time commitment. That's the point of it. She waited. He wrapped his hands around the coffee mug. She noticed this the way his hands settled, the same settling quality she'd watched in the garage, the physical ease of someone who was not performing ease. About 7 years ago, there was a public situation involving one of our early military contracts. A project failed. The official story was technical failure. The actual story was more complicated. There were congressional hearings. My name was in the press for about 4 months. I remember something about that, she said. I'd have to look up the specifics. The specifics involved me saying things publicly that needed to be said and that cost us 3 major contracts in the following year. He looked at his coffee. We survived it. The company survived it. But I learned something during those 4 months that I couldn't unlearn. What did you learn? That most of the people who were suddenly interested in my opinions had been entirely uninterested in my opinions the week before the hearings. And that it worked in reverse too. The people who'd been interested in me before were suddenly less interested when the press got complicated. He looked up. I'm not saying that with bitterness. I'm saying it factually. And so the garage. I needed a place where what I was doing had nothing to do with what my company was doing, where the work was between me and the machine, and the outcome was the only evaluation. He paused. I also genuinely love restoring cars. She looked at him. Why didn't you tell me who you were? Because you didn't ask. That's not an answer. He was quiet for a moment. When you came in the first time, distressed, checking your phone, clearly used to a certain level of professional control, I could have said who I was. I chose not to. Partly because I don't lead with it. Partly because the conversation was more interesting without it. More interesting for whom? Both of us, I think. She would have argued with this on principle, but the principle was complicated by the fact that it was true. You could have told me during the second visit. I could have. And the third? Yes. Why didn't you? He met her eyes. Because by the third visit, I was reasonably sure you'd come back a 4th time for reasons that had nothing to do with the car, and I didn't want to change that dynamic before I understood what it was. She was quiet. Outside, the October Street was doing what October Streets did. People with their coat collars up, leaves gusting across the crosswalk, the particular light of a Friday afternoon when the week was nearly over. That's either very honest, she said, or very manipulative. I've thought about which one it is, he said. I lean toward honest, but I accept that it doesn't look that way. No, she said, it doesn't. She turned her coffee mug a quarter turn on the table. I'm going to be in the same room with you professionally, Benjamin. I work in the defense contracting space. You have a company in the defense contracting space. That's a complication. I know. You should have told me. You're right. She looked at him. He said it without flinching and without the performance of contrition, just as a factual acknowledgement. And she'd sat across the table from enough people who couldn't say, "You're right," without spending 10 minutes protecting themselves first, that she knew what it cost and what it was worth. All right, she said. All right, meaning what? Meaning I understand why you made the decision you made. I disagree with it, and I'm putting it in the appropriate file rather than letting it contaminate everything else. He looked at her steadily. What's the appropriate file? Significant, but not disqualifying. The corner of his mouth shifted. Not a smile exactly. Something near one. That's a very precise system. I have a very precise system for most things. I've noticed. They sat with the coffee and the warm light and talked for another 45 minutes. Not about the garage or the company or the conference or Whitmore or any of the things that would inevitably be complicated. They talked about the Mustang's interior, which he was sourcing original material for, and about a paper she'd read in a defense procurement journal that had been wrong in one specific and important way, and about what she'd meant when she'd said she got calm under pressure, and what he'd meant when he'd said that could be just as intimidating. She left at 4:10, which was 10 minutes late for her call, and the first time she'd been late for anything in 6 weeks. She sat in her car in the parking garage before she started the engine and let the quiet be what it was. She was thinking about a man who'd built a multi-billion-dollar company and spent his days in a garage listening to Beethoven, and who had looked at her with the specific quality of someone who was paying attention rather than waiting for his turn, and who had said "you're right" to her face without decoration. She was also thinking about 3 anomalies in a bid package and a company name that had appeared in an Armature Institute partnership announcement, and what exactly that might mean for the next several weeks of her professional life. Both things were true simultaneously. She started the car. She did not Google him obsessively. She read what was available because it was professionally relevant, and because not reading it would have been a choice that itself communicated something she didn't want to communicate to herself. Hale Defense Technologies had been founded 12 years ago by Benjamin Hale and a partner, Marcus Webb, who now served as COO with seed capital that the industry press described as modest, in a tone that suggested they found this unusual. The company's first product was a guidance system component that solved a problem most people in the industry hadn't admitted was a problem yet. It had taken 3 years to gain traction and 2 more years to become the kind of traction that turned modest seed capital into something else. The congressional hearing situation was documented in archived trade press from 6 years ago. A military drone reconnaissance program had produced data that turned out to be inaccurate under specific field conditions. Hale Defense had manufactured the sensor array. Benjamin had testified before the Armed Services Subcommittee that the field conditions in question had been flagged in the company's original specifications, and that the program had been deployed outside those specifications by the contracting agency. He had said this precisely and without apology, and had included documentation. 3 subsequent investigations had confirmed his account. The contracts he'd lost anyway were with agencies that had, as far as she could tell from what was public, preferred not to be confirmed right. She put the research aside after 2 hours. He wasn't hiding because he'd done anything wrong. He was hiding because he'd done something right and had learned from the experience that being right didn't protect you, and that information could only be processed in so many ways. She understood this better than she'd expected to. She called the Monday morning all-hands at Meridian with 3 items on the agenda. 2 were routine. The third was the Whitmore bid package, which she laid out without conclusions, just the 3 anomalies she'd identified, and asked her team to come back with independent assessments by Wednesday. Her senior analyst, a careful man named Devin, who'd been with her for 7 years, asked after the meeting whether she'd identified a source. "Not yet," she said. "I know what it looks like. I need to know what it is before I say that. It looks like someone with inside access is shaping the bid around a competing structure." "Yes, it does." She looked at the printed bid summary on her desk, which means either someone at Whitmore is working against Whitmore or someone is managing access to the process from outside. Or both. Or both, she agreed. She thought about the Armature Institute and its new partnership with Hale Defense Technologies. And then she stopped thinking about it because thinking about it felt different now than it would have felt 2 weeks ago, and she needed her thinking on this matter to be clean. She went to a meeting. She went to another meeting. She had lunch at her desk. She picked up her phone at 2:30 and set it down and picked it up again and texted. "I have a professional question that might overlap with a personal situation. I'm not sure how to navigate the overlap. JM." His response came back in 7 minutes. "Tell me the professional question and we'll figure out the personal part afterward." She stared at the text for a moment and then typed. Hale Defense Technologies' name appeared in Armature Institute materials in connection with a federal program that intersects with work I'm doing. I'm trying to determine whether that creates a conflict. A longer pause this time. She imagined him at the garage, one earbud in, reading this on a phone he'd pulled from the pocket of his work pants. "It might. Depends on the specifics. Can we meet Thursday? I have a board presentation Thursday afternoon. Morning is open. Garage at 9. We can talk there or somewhere else if you prefer." She looked at that last message. The offer of somewhere else, not because the garage was inconvenient, but because he was being careful about what he was asking her to walk into. She recognized the calibration of it. "The garage is fine," she typed. She drove out Thursday morning with a folder on the passenger seat containing nothing she would leave in anyone else's hands. And she thought on the way about how she was going to handle a conversation that needed to be professional, but could not be entirely professional given the facts of the situation. And she thought about this for most of the drive and arrived at the garage no clearer than when she'd started. His truck was in the lot. The overhead door was open. The Mustang had its clear coat now. She could see that from outside. The red was deep and perfect, and it was nearly done. He came out when he heard the gravel. He was in work clothes again. He seemed to always be in the middle of something when she arrived, which she decided was not staged, and he wiped his hands with the blue rag and waited while she got out and got her folder. "Come inside," he said. The small office where his assistant worked was empty today. He had made coffee. There were 2 chairs that she hadn't noticed on previous visits because they'd been partly blocked by a filing cabinet that had been moved. She sat. He sat across from her. She put the folder on the table between them without opening it. Hale Defense is partnering with Armature on a federal technology integration program. Yes. Whitmore Defense Systems is bidding on a similar program, possibly the same program, possibly adjacent. I'm working for Whitmore in an advisory capacity. He was quiet. The bid package I'm reviewing has 3 anomalies that suggest someone with access to the competing structure has shaped Whitmore's submission against it, not around it against it. Benjamin's face did something careful and contained. That's a serious allegation. I haven't made an allegation. I've described 3 anomalies in a document. She met his eyes. I need to know whether your company's program information has had any unauthorized access or exposure. Not that I'm aware of, but I'll need to verify that. I need you to verify it without telling anyone at Whitmore that you're doing so. He held her gaze. You think the exposure might have gone the other direction. I think I don't know which direction it went, or whether it went anywhere. I may be looking at coincidence and pattern matching because I'm paid to pattern match. She looked down at the folder. But I need to either rule it out or not. He was quiet for a long moment. The garage sounds came through a compressor cycling metal, on metal, the ambient sounds of work. She found herself aware that this was his actual life, not a performance of a life, and that she was in the middle of it. I'll have Marcus run a discrete access audit, he said. 2 days. That works. I'm going to need you to tell me more about what you found in the Whitmore package. She looked at him. That information is client protected. I know. And if it turns out there's no intersection with my company, it stays that way. He held her gaze steadily. But if there is an intersection, you're going to need someone who knows my systems from the inside. You can't navigate this alone. She knew he was right. She didn't immediately say so because knowing someone was right and agreeing out loud were 2 different things that she had learned to separate in professional situations. 2 days, she said. Then we decide whether this conversation continues. He nodded. She stood and picked up the folder. She looked at the Mustang through the window into the bay. From here, with the light hitting it right, it was finished. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. It's beautiful, she said. Yeah, he said. It is. She left. Marcus Webb's audit came back in 36 hours. A brief direct email to Benjamin, which he forwarded to her with 1 line. Nothing on our end. But look at paragraph 2. Paragraph 2 described an unusual pattern of access to a procurement planning document. Not their document. A government-adjacent planning document they'd had legitimate access to as part of the Armature partnership. The access pattern was unusual, not because of when it had occurred, but because of where an IP address that geolocated to a commercial building in McLean, Virginia. She sat with that information for most of a morning. Then she called Devin. I need the registration information for every corporate entity operating out of the Meridian block in McLean, she said. That's a big building, Jasper. I know. Start with defense-adjacent firms. Devin called back at 2. I've got 47 entities. Want me to filter for any with Whitmore executive overlap? Yes, do it. She thought while she waited. She thought about the shape of a problem when you could see the edges, but not the center. And she thought about 3 anomalies in a bid package that were either coincidence or weren't. And she thought about the specific discomfort of professional situations that required you to decide who you trusted before you had enough information to decide reliably. Devin called back in 20 minutes. 3 overlapping entities. 1 is Whitmore's own DC office, which makes sense. The second is a law firm that does their regulatory work. The third, he paused. This one's interesting. She waited. It's a consulting firm, specialized defense strategy. It was founded 4 years ago. The principal is a former partner at your company, Jasper. She was very still. Who? She said. Gerald Foss. She put her hand flat on the desk. Gerald Foss had been her mentor for the first 8 years of her career at Meridian. He'd left to start his own practice 4 years ago. She had attended his going-away dinner. She had at various points over the 4 subsequent years used him as a sounding board for situations she found difficult, the way you use someone who knew your industry and knew you and who you trusted with the things that were too large or too close to think about alone. Thank you, Devin, she said. Jasper, Close the loop on this. I'll tell you what I need next when I know. She hung up. She sat at her desk with her hand still flat on it and thought about Gerald Foss, who had been patient with her when she was 26 and certain about everything, and who had told her that the problem with certainty was that it made you slow on the days when you needed to be fast. He had been right about that. He had been right about many things. She thought about what it would mean if he was right about this. She texted Benjamin, "We need to talk." He called her back in 4 minutes. They met at the restaurant where they'd had coffee the Friday after the conference. She arrived first and ordered water and sat in the booth and looked at the menu she didn't need to look at, and when he came in, he read her posture before he read anything else, and he sat down and didn't say anything immediately. "The access pattern," she said. "The McLean address." "Yes. I have a possible source. It's someone I know personally." She looked at him directly. "I'm telling you this because you need to know the full picture, and because—" She stopped. "Because," he said, "because I'm not sure what I'm going to do next, and I find that I want to think it through with someone." He was quiet. He looked at her for a moment with the same gray-eyed steadiness she'd encountered the first day in the garage, the quality of attention she'd described to herself as not performing presence because there was no better way to say it. "Who is it?" he said. "Someone who taught me most of what I know about this industry." He waited. "My mentor," she said. "Gerald Foss. He left Meridian 4 years ago and has a consulting practice in McLean. His firm's address matches the access point in Marcus's audit." The silence was careful and weighted. Outside, a gust of wind moved leaves across the window. "That's hard," he said. "Yes." She turned her water glass a half turn. "It's also possible I'm connecting dots that aren't a line. The address is in a commercial building. He's not the only tenant, and Gerald is. He's brilliant, and he's someone I respected, and the probability that I'm wrong feels simultaneously very high and very low." "Because you don't want to be right. Because if I'm right, then I've been using someone as a sounding board who had a financial interest in the projects I was discussing with him." She looked at the table. "For 4 years. Benjamin was quiet for a moment. "What have you told him?" "Nothing specific about the Whitmore contract. I've talked to him in general terms about the program we're working on. Enough context that someone with industry knowledge could orient themselves." She looked up. "Enough that it wouldn't look accidental if it turned out to be deliberate." "What do you need from me?" She'd been asking herself this question for the last 2 hours. She'd thought about what she needed from Marcus, what she needed from Devin, what she needed from the 3 other people in her professional world who she trusted with difficult problems. She'd thought about what she needed alone. "I need to know whether what I have is enough to bring to Whitmore," she said. "If I bring this to them and I'm wrong, I've accused someone who doesn't deserve it, and I've created a professional situation that doesn't recover. And if you're right, then I've given them the information they need to protect themselves, and I've also had to confront what it means that I didn't see it sooner." She met his eyes. "Neither outcome is clean." Benjamin looked at her for a long time, not evaluating. Something else, the look of someone thinking about what was true. "I can have Marcus dig further," he said. "He has contacts in the procurement space who can pull access records without creating formal documentation. Discreetly. If there's more, we'll find it. If there isn't, you have your answer. That's your resource to spend." "Yes, I'm choosing to spend it." She looked at him across the table. She'd known him for less than 2 months. She'd sat in his garage and talked about Beethoven and her father's car. She'd sat in the conference hall and watched him hold a room of 200 people with the particular quality of someone who was saying true things. She'd sat across from him 3 times now in this corner booth and had noticed each time that he did not make her feel evaluated. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. He ordered coffee when the server came by and she ordered more water, and they stayed for another hour. And what she remembered of that hour afterward was not what they discussed, but the quality of the discussion. The way he asked questions that opened space rather than closing it. The way silence between them had become comfortable without either of them acknowledging when that had happened. She drove home in the November dark and thought about Gerald Foss, whom she'd trusted, and Benjamin Hale, whom she was beginning to trust, and the difference between the two. The Marcus dig took 5 days. In those 5 days, Jasper continued to work on the Whitmore account, as if nothing had shifted, which was the professional behavior the situation required, and also the hardest thing she'd done in recent memory. She answered Gerald Foss's Tuesday check-in call, a routine that had been in place for years, and talked about the defense industry and the procurement cycle and nothing specific, and the conversation felt exactly like every other conversation they'd had, and she hated that it did. Devin asked twice if she was okay. She told him twice that she was focused, which was true, and not an answer to his question, but was the available response. She went to the garage on a Wednesday. This was not scheduled. She drove out Route 9 and the Mustang was in the second bay now, interior done, and it was completely finished. He wasn't there when she arrived. His assistant, whose name she'd learned was Carol, looked up from her desk and said he was on a call in the back office, but would be done in 10 minutes. She sat in the waiting room and looked at the Mustang through the window. It was something, not in a way she could quantify, not in the way she quantified most things. It was a car that was exactly what it was supposed to be, restored to its original specifications, with the patience to get every detail right, and it had taken 8 months and it was done. And there was something in looking at it that made her feel not hopeful exactly, reminded of something. She didn't know what she'd been reminded of when Benjamin appeared in the doorway. "You didn't have an appointment," he said. "I know." Something happened. "No, I needed to drive." He looked at her for a moment. "You want to see the interior?" She did. He walked her around to the driver's side and opened the door. The black pony upholstery was perfect. Not new-looking exactly, but correct, the specific texture and pattern of 1967, the console between the bucket seats with the shifter she'd known it would have. The dashboard was original gauges, no aftermarket additions. She didn't get in. She just looked. "Does it run?" she asked. "Want to find out?" He drove. She sat in the passenger seat and the engine ran the way a properly rebuilt American V8 ran in November, which was with a sound that had no good description except that it was exactly what it was supposed to be. And the road curved through the bare trees, and the landscape was gray and brown, and the Mustang was red, and everything about it was very specific and present. Neither of them talked. He drove for 20 minutes and came back to the garage and pulled in and let the engine idle for a moment before he cut it. "Thank you," she said. "You seemed like you needed something to have a point." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead through the windshield at the back wall of the garage at the pegboard with its organized tools. "That's exactly what I needed," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I had a feeling." Marcus's report landed on a Friday afternoon. She read it at her office desk and then read it again and then sat for a very long time. The access pattern wasn't incidental. 3 separate access events to the armature-adjacent planning documents, each from the McLean address, each at times that corresponded to periods when Gerald Foss's firm would have been preparing materials for clients. Clients who, based on public record, included 2 defense contractors that were in direct competition with Whitmore for the same federal contract. Not proof of intent, not proof of wrongdoing, but a pattern that was no longer a coincidence. She thought about Gerald Foss. She thought about being 26 and wrong about something important, and having someone explain to her patiently why she was wrong without making her feel stupid. And she thought about the going-away dinner and the toast she'd made at it, and she thought about the call she'd had with him on Tuesday and how normal it had felt. She thought about how long it took to trust someone and how quickly that could stop being true. She picked up her phone and called Benjamin. "I have it," she said when he answered. A pause. "I'll come to you, or you come here, whatever works." "I'll come there." She was already reaching for her coat. "An hour." She told him the full picture that evening, sitting in the office at the back of the garage, while Carol had gone home and the bay was quiet, and the Mustang sat in the second bay in its finished red perfection. He listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both precise and necessary. He looked at the report Marcus had sent and read it carefully. "This goes to Whitmore," he said. "I know. You've been sitting on it for the 5 days it took to develop." "I've been responsible for 5 days," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her. "There is." He set the report down. "Will you call Gerald Foss first?" The question surprised her. She'd been asking herself the same thing for 40 minutes. I don't know what the ethical structure of that is." "Professionally, you probably don't." "No." "Personally?" He paused. "You've known him for 16 years. If this is what it looks like, he's going to need to know you found it. If it's somehow not what it looks like, he needs the chance to explain." She looked at the desk. "If I call him, and it is what it looks like, he might have time to cover something." "Yes." "So the professionally correct thing and the personally correct thing are in direct conflict." "Yes," he said again. He wasn't offering a resolution. He was just agreeing with her about the shape of the situation, which was, she was finding its own kind of useful. "I'll bring it to Whitmore first," she said. "Then I'll call Gerald." "That's probably right," she breathed. The garage was very quiet. Through the high windows, the November night was cold and clear, and she could see the edges of stars. "I've built my professional life on seeing things clearly," she said, "on reading situations correctly, on being in rooms and knowing what the room is actually saying." She turned the report over on the desk face down. "I didn't see this." "You saw it." "Late?" "You saw it." He looked at her directly. "Before anyone else did. Without the full picture. With a personal relationship making it harder to see." He paused. "You saw it." She held his gaze for a moment. "I'm being hard on myself," she said. "A little. I'll stop." "Not necessary to stop entirely," he said, just accurately. She almost smiled. The situation was not one that produced smiles, but the specific word accurately in his voice, with its dry precision, was close enough to what she'd needed that something in her chest released. She drove home that night and didn't sleep much and called Whitmore's CEO at 7 the next morning and drove to their offices and sat in a very controlled conference room and told them precisely what she'd found and how she'd found it and what she could document and what was still inference. They listened. They asked questions. They were serious people in a serious situation, and they handled it the way serious people did, which was with focus and without panic. When she left at 11, the investigation was officially in motion. She sat in the car in the parking garage and texted Benjamin Dunn. His response, "How are you?" She thought about that for a moment. Tired, relieved, angry, not sure in what order. His response took a minute. "Come by the garage if you want. Carol's off. I'm working on the Falcon." She drove to the garage. The Falcon was a 1964 Sprint coupe she hadn't seen before, pulled halfway into the first bay and already disassembled in a way that suggested it had been that way for a while. Benjamin was under the front end doing something she couldn't see. She sat in the waiting room. She got coffee. She read a paperback from the shelf, a thriller she didn't particularly follow, just words in order, and listened to the sounds of the garage, the deliberate metal on metal of someone who knew what they were doing. And after about an hour, she put the book down and looked at the Falcon through the window and was aware that she'd stopped being angry sometime in the last hour and was now just tired in the way that meant something was finished. He appeared in the doorway, grease on his hands, blue rag. The November light was low and direct through the windows. "Better," he said, "getting there." He came in and got his own coffee and sat in the other chair, and they were quiet together for a while, which had become, she realized, a thing. They did a thing that had developed out of garage visits and coffee cups and the space between sentences where the actual communication happened. "I'm going to call Gerald tomorrow," she said. "Okay. I don't know what I'm going to say." "You'll find it." She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee, not at her, and there was something in his profile, the lines of his face in the afternoon light, the particular quality of his stillness that she had recognized for several weeks, but hadn't let herself organize into the correct category. She organized it now. She looked at the coffee she was holding and at the window into the bay where a 64 Falcon sat in useful disassembly and at the November light that made everything it touched feel specific and true. She was not going to say anything about what she'd just recognized. The timing was wrong, and the situation was complicated, and she was at this particular moment too tired and too much in the middle of something that wasn't finished. But she organized it into the correct category, and she kept it there, and she drove home an hour later with the clarity of someone who knew exactly what was in the file, even if she wasn't ready to open it yet. "Well," Gerald Foss answered on the second ring, which he always did. He had told her once that he'd made a rule early in his career: you answer or you don't. And he answered because the alternative communicated something about how you valued other people's time. She had admired this rule for 16 years. "Jasper," he said. "Good timing. I was just reading the Armature Institute Quarterly. What do you make of the new partnership structure there?" "Gerald," she said. He stopped. He heard it, whatever it was in her voice, the specific quality of something she needed to say that she hadn't yet said. She'd heard him use the same technique with clients, the way he'd say a name and let the name do the work of stopping a conversation that needed to be stopped. He'd taught her that, actually. "All right," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "Tell me," she told him. Not everything, not the Marcus audit, not the access pattern, not what she'd given to Whitmore, but the shape of it, what she'd noticed in the bid package, the anomalies, the McLean address, the timeline. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she'd started to think the call had dropped. "Gerald, I'm here." His voice was different. Older maybe, or more precise the way voices got when there was nothing left to do with them but be accurate. How much do you know? Enough to have brought it to Whitmore yesterday. Another silence. I see. Did you know I was working that account? I knew you were working in that space. I didn't know the specifics. He paused. That's true, Jasper. Whatever else that's true. She didn't know whether she believed him. She noted this carefully, the specific experience of not knowing whether she believed someone she'd trusted for 16 years, and she stored it in the correct file. I'm going to need you to tell me what happened, she said. Not for Whitmore's investigation. For me. He was quiet for a long time. It started as research, he said. I had a client competing for the same program. I had legitimate access to the planning documents through a separate advisory relationship. What I did with that access, the way I used the context I had, it wasn't clean, Jasper. I knew it wasn't clean when I was doing it. A pause. I told myself it was industry knowledge, that information moves around in this space, and that I was just moving it faster. You told yourself something that let you do it. Yes. She sat at her kitchen table with the phone against her ear, and November light in the window, and a cup of tea gone cold. Why? She said. The company was struggling. My first 2 years were difficult. I had clients who needed results, and he stopped. That's not an answer, is it? No. He breathed. I don't have a good answer for the why. I have a real one, which is that I was afraid and I made a bad decision, and I didn't stop making it because stopping felt like admitting I'd started, which is exactly what I told you not to do when you were 26. She looked at the window. The light was flat and November cold and entirely without sentiment. I know, he said. I know what you're thinking. I'm thinking that I trusted you with things. I know. I talked to you about this program in general terms. I know. I didn't use anything specific, you said, Jasper. I need you to... He stopped again. That doesn't matter. I understand that it doesn't matter. The relationship was compromised, and I knew it was compromised, and I let it continue. His voice was level, not defensive. I'm sorry. I'm not saying that to make this easier. I'm saying it because it's true and because I owe you that. She stayed on the phone for another few minutes. They said a few more things, none of which moved the situation. And then she said she had to go, and he said he understood, and she hung up and sat at the kitchen table until the light shifted, and her tea was not just cold, but cold in the way of something that had been forgotten. She didn't cry. She wasn't a person who cried often, and this didn't feel like a crying situation. It felt like a different kind of loss, the kind that was more like subtraction than grief. A relationship that had been real had turned out to be partly false, and the partly real parts were now inseparable from the partly false parts, which meant the whole was altered. She sent a text, called him. He confirmed it. He apologized. Benjamin's response. How did that go? She thought about how to answer that. About as well as it could have, she typed. Which isn't very well, but is what's true. His response came back after a moment. Yeah, that sounds right. Thanksgiving was 3 weeks away. Jasper spent those 3 weeks working, which she was good at, and not thinking about Gerald Foss more than necessary, which she was getting better at, and talking to Benjamin 2 or 3 times a week. Once in the garage. When she drove out for no professional reason, she could state clearly and twice on the phone with a regularity that had crept up on her without either of them remarking on it. He called on a Tuesday evening when she was in the middle of a grant proposal she was reviewing for a client. She answered because she answered. I'm making dinner, he said. Pasta. I overcalculated the amount and I hate eating alone, and I'm approximately 40 minutes from Georgetown if you want to eat something that isn't whatever you would have made. She looked at the grant proposal. She looked at the kitchen. The grant proposal was work, and the kitchen contained things that would combine into something adequate. What kind of pasta? Carbonara. Real carbonara, not the cream version. I'll be there in 50 minutes. She drove to an address in a quiet neighborhood in Annapolis. Not the garage, but a house 2 miles from it, older with good bones and a porch that looked out over a yard with trees she couldn't see clearly in the dark. He met her at the door without ceremony and handed her a glass of wine that was better than she'd expected, and his kitchen was the kind of kitchen that got used. They ate at the kitchen table. The carbonara was exactly right. She knew carbonara well enough to know when it was wrong and it wasn't wrong. He'd made a salad too, nothing complicated, just well-dressed greens, and there was bread that he'd bought from somewhere. Tell me about the falcon, she said. He told her about this falcon. The Sprint Coupe was the performance variant of what had been a fairly unassuming compact, and someone had added non-original components sometime in the 70s, and his job now was to find what was salvageable and what needed replacing, and to make every decision with the understanding that the car would outlive him if he did it right. "Do you think about that?" she asked. "The car outliving you?" "With the classics, yes. It's part of why I do it right." He pushed the bread toward her. "Take more." She took more. "Do you have any family kids?" "No kids. A sister in Portland. A brother in London. Parents are gone." He looked at his wine. My parents divorced when I was 14. My mother is in Phoenix. My father is still in Pennsylvania where he grew up." She thought about the '68 Mustang and then let it go. "No siblings? I have 2 friends I've had since college who I see 3 or 4 times a year, and a collection of professional relationships that are more complex than that sounds. No kids. I made decisions about my career in my 30s that made that less possible, and by the time I'd started to think about it differently," she stopped. She picked up her wine. "I don't have a clean answer to that." He looked at her across the kitchen table. "You don't need one." "I know." She looked back. "Do you?" "Regrets about it. Sometimes. Less than I expected." He was quiet for a moment. "I think there are people who should have children and people who are better at other things. I'm probably the second kind. That used to feel like a failing. And now I build things that have a long life, and I restore things that were worth saving, and I work for a company that I hope does some good before I'm done." He shrugged slightly. "That's a life. I'm reasonably certain it's mine." She watched him. He said these things the way he said most things accurately, without defensiveness or performance, with the particular ease of someone who'd spent enough time with themselves to have arrived at a settled position. She was aware that she was not that kind of settled, and that it wasn't a failing, and that the two of them were different enough in this specific way that it was interesting rather than difficult. "I'm not sure I know what mine is yet," she said. "My life, as a thing I'm certain is mine." "You're 40. 39. You have time." She made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "You sound very confident about that." "I'm 46, he said. "I have moderate confidence that 49 isn't too late to figure things out, which implies 39 is fine. That's a very modest standard." "I'm a modest person." She laughed, actually laughed unexpectedly, and he watched her with something in his expression that she recognized. Now the quality she'd been calling steadiness, that was really something closer to warmth, the warmth of someone who didn't perform pleasure at another person's laughter, but simply had it. She stayed until 11. She drove home in the November dark, with the windows up and the radio off, and was aware the whole drive home of the specific weight and warmth of a good evening in someone's kitchen. The way that dinner cooked well and wine poured right, and conversation that moved the way real conversation moved, not performing itself, not working toward anything, was one of the small things that adult life either contained or didn't. And she'd spent enough years in the didn't column to understand what the did column felt like. It felt like this. She texted from the driveway. "Thank you." The carbonara was excellent. His response came back almost immediately. "Good. Drive safely next time, too." She looked at that for a moment. Next time said so easily, with such assurance that there would be a next time. And the assurance was not presumptuous, but simply accurate. And she put her phone in her bag and went inside and was asleep by midnight for the first time in 3 weeks. December arrived with a cold front and a series of complications that Jasper would later describe to Renata as the kind of month that earns you the next month off. And Renata would later point out that Jasper had not taken the next month off. But first, December. The Whitmore investigation produced a formal finding in its 3rd week, just in time to compete with the holiday calendar for space and everyone's attention. Gerald Foss's consulting firm was named in a breach of procurement protocol notification, not criminal charges, which required a higher standard of proof than what Whitmore's legal team was prepared to pursue, but a formal professional sanction that would be reported to the relevant industry associations. His firm would likely not survive it. Jasper was kept informed because she'd been the one to find it, and because Whitmore's CEO had the integrity to keep her in the loop, rather than simply using what she'd given them and moving on. She processed the formal finding, the way she processed most things privately, thoroughly, with a specific economy of feeling that she'd developed over 20 years of doing work that was sometimes consequential enough to hurt. She did not attend any of the proceedings. She sent Devon to observe. She answered the questions she was asked by the relevant parties and did not offer more than what was asked. She did not call Gerald Foss again. She thought about calling him and decided that the call would be more for her than for him, and that what it was for her wasn't something she was ready to name, so she let it wait. Benjamin asked about it on the phone one night in the second week of December, not pushing, just asking. "It's done professionally," she said. "The personal part is less resolved." "What do you need it to resolve into?" She thought about that. "I need to know whether what I learned about him changes what I learned from him." "Does it?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "Not the things that were true. The things he taught me that were right are still right. It's just complicated to hold both." "It's always complicated to hold both," he said. "The person who taught you something real and the person who did something wrong, they're the same person." "I know that intellectually." "Intellectually is a start." She made the sound that might have been a laugh. It had started happening more that sound in the middle of conversations with him. Not a full laugh, always just the precursor to one, the shift in the chest that came from being surprised by something that was true. She drove to Annapolis twice in December. Once for professional reasons, a follow-up conversation about what hail defense needed to do proactively in light of the Whitmore situation, which had cast a mild shadow over any company adjacent to the program. Once for no professional reason at all, which she acknowledged to herself on the drive out without finding it particularly alarming. The second visit was a Saturday mid-December, gray and cold. He was working on the Falcon. She sat in the waiting room for a while and then migrated to the bay doorway, and then when he looked up and said, "You can come in," came into the bay and sat on a clean stool near the workbench and watched him work. The 64 Sprint was in better shape than it had been. The engine was out and on a stand being rebuilt. The body was rough but solid. A common story with Falcons, he'd explained, because they were modest enough cars that no one had babied them, but also modest enough that no one had driven them hard enough to ruin them. "What'll it be worth when you're done?" she asked. He considered the question while he did something careful with the cylinder head. "Maybe 40-45. Depends on the originality of some of the trim." "You've put in more than that in labor." "Yes? So you don't do this for the money?" "I do this because this particular car has been waiting since 1983 for someone to do it right, and I have the skills and the time, and it seems like a waste to let it sit." He looked up from the engine. "There are worse reasons." She thought about that. "What's the equivalent in your company?" He was quiet, working steadily. "The guidance system work was," he said after a while. "Early on, we developed a component that solved a problem in targeting accuracy that had gotten soldiers killed. Not a dramatic fix, no one wrote about it in that language. But I know what it did, and that's similar." He paused. "You put in more than it's worth economically, because the alternative is letting something sit that doesn't need to sit." She watched his hands. He'd picked up the cylinder head and was examining it with the same quality of attention she'd seen him give everything total unhurried, as if the thing being examined deserved its full due before the next decision. "I envy that," she said. He looked up. "What?" "Knowing that your work has a specific effect on specific things. My work is mostly systemic. I improve processes. I find flaws. I help organizations function better, but it's diffuse." She picked up a clean bolt from the workbench and set it down again. "I can't point to a thing and say that because I did this that happened." "You pointed to a thing at Whitmore. That's not typical. Maybe it's pointing at what kind of work you want more of." She looked at him. He said it easily, not as a revelation, just as an observation, and it landed with the particular weight of something that had been waiting to be said. She turned the bolt again. "My sister would tell you I've been in the wrong room for years. She's not diplomatic." "You don't have a sister." "If I had a sister," she put the bolt down. "The point stands." He looked at her with the question in his eyes, the unasked version, the one that gave her space. "I'm 40 next year," she said, "and I'm very good at what I do, and I've spent a long time using very good at what I do as the answer to most questions that were actually asking something else." What were they asking? She looked at the Falcon's engine on its stand. It was a small engine by modern standards, 170 cubic inches, he'd told her, the inline six. Modest, efficient, designed to last. "Whether I've built a life or a career." He was quiet for a moment. "Can it be both?" he said. "It's been mostly the second." She looked at him directly. "I notice you're not telling me they're the same thing." "They're not the same thing." "No." They stayed in that quiet for a moment. The garage was cold in the way that garages were cold in December. Not unpleasant. Just present the specific temperature of metal and concrete and outside air coming in at the edges of the bay door. What would the life part look like? He asked. She thought about it honestly rather than reaching for the comfortable answer. I don't know exactly. I know what it doesn't look like. It doesn't look like checking my phone in a restaurant. It doesn't look like an empty row house that I've had for 8 years and never made look like anything. She paused. It looks like this possibly, which is not what I expected to say. She meant the garage. She meant the particular quality of a Saturday afternoon with someone who was doing real work and making space for her to be real alongside him. She might have meant more than that. She chose not to specify. Good, he said. He said it quietly and without weight, just a single word, and he turned back to the engine. She sat on the stool for another hour and said very little and felt slowly and without fanfare something she hadn't felt in years, which was the specific ease of being somewhere she was actually permitted to be herself. The kiss happened 10 days before Christmas. She had not been expecting it, which was unusual for her. She was generally good at anticipating the trajectory of situations, but she'd been distracted for reasons that will become clear, and he had been similarly occupied in the specific chemistry of a long evening that arrived at the right moment and the wrong circumstances was something she couldn't have predicted, even if she'd been paying attention. They'd had dinner at his house again. Not planned in advance, she'd been in Annapolis for a meeting that ended at 5, and he'd texted asking if she wanted to stop by, and she'd said yes, and arrived to find him making something with good ingredients and no visible plan. She'd sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and watched him figure out what dinner was going to be. Which was it? Turned out a kind of cooking she'd never actually done working with. What was there rather than working from what you'd planned? And the result was a roast chicken with root vegetables that had no business being as good as it was. They ate and talked, and the conversation moved in the way their conversations moved now, which was easily and with the kind of depth that built up without either of them engineering it. He told her about Marcus and the early days of the company, the specific terror of having taken money from 3 investors who trusted his technical judgment and not yet knowing whether the judgment would be justified. She told him about her first year at Meridian when she'd been 28 and already better at the work than most of the people above her and had not yet learned how to be better without making them feel worse about it. How'd you learn? He asked. I failed at it enough times to understand what failing at it cost. She turned her wine glass. There was a senior partner who I'd essentially steamrolled in a client presentation. He didn't fight back. He just got quiet and started excluding me from certain rooms, and those rooms turned out to be important. She paused. I'd been right about the thing I'd steamrolled him on. Being right doesn't always mean you did it right. He was quiet for a moment. Someone told me something similar about 10 years ago, an old colonel who'd been consulting with us. He looked at his wine. I didn't listen to him. And the congressional hearings. He set the glass down. I was right about everything I said in that hearing, and I said it in a way that made the people who needed to help me fix the problem feel attacked rather than informed. He paused. Being right isn't a strategy. No, she agreed. It's just a condition. They were quiet for a while. The kitchen clock moved. The wine was nearly finished. What happened to the colonel? She asked. He died. About 3 years after. Benjamin looked at the table. Cancer. I went to the funeral. His wife told me he'd followed what happened to our company and was glad we'd survived it. A pause. I hadn't known he was following it. She looked at him. There was something in his face, not sadness exactly, but the particular quality of unresolved respect, the kind you felt for someone you hadn't adequately acknowledged when you had the chance. He sounds like someone worth knowing, she said. He was. He looked up. You would have liked him. He had that same quality. You have the one where you say the exact true thing and then wait and see whether the room is ready for it. She felt the words settle somewhere in her chest. Not the compliment she recognized compliments as information, and filed them, but the specific accuracy of it, the sense of being described correctly by someone who'd been paying attention. She didn't say anything. He reached across the kitchen table and touched the back of her hand. Not urgently, not as a prelude, just a hand touching a hand in the way that meant, I am here and you are here, and this is what this moment contains. She turned her hand over. They stayed like that for a moment, and then he stood and came around the table, and she stood, and they were the same height almost. She was close to 6 feet, and he was close to 6'2", and the gap was small enough that when he put his hand along the side of her face, she didn't have to look up very far. She kissed him, or they kissed each other. These things were rarely as one-directional as the language suggested. It was a quiet kiss. Not tentative. There was nothing tentative about either of them, individually or apparently collectively, but quiet in the way that things were quiet when they'd been considered. When both people had thought about it and had not acted on thinking about it, and then one night in a kitchen in Annapolis with the clock on the wall and the remains of a roast chicken and a conversation about dead colonels and congressional hearings and the difference between being right and doing it right, it happened. She pulled back. Not far. He was looking at her. Okay, she said. Okay, he agreed. She drove home an hour later. She did not call Renata, though she would in the morning. She did not examine what had happened or categorize it or file it. She drove home in the December dark with the heat on and the radio off and felt for the first time in a very long time the specific disorientation of something changing that you wanted to change. Her mentor's investigation finished 1 week before Christmas. The formal notification went out on a Wednesday. The industry association sanctioned the reporting requirements, the formal record. The Christmas season was a strange time for it, but administrative processes didn't organize themselves around emotional calendars. She read the notification at her office desk. She thought about Gerald Foss, who was now 62, and whose firm was almost certainly done, and whose 16 years of teaching her things that were genuinely true were not canceled but were complicated in ways that did not simplify. She did not call him. She made a decision that the call she'd been putting off needed to wait until the formal process was complete, and she could go into it without the ongoing investigation as a weight between them. The investigation was now complete. She called him on a Thursday afternoon. He answered. They talked for 30 minutes. It was not a comfortable conversation. He asked her to tell him not as a request, but as a statement of understanding what it had been like to find what she'd found. She told him honestly, including the part where she'd sat with it for 5 days, and continued to meet with him during that time, and felt each time both guilty and certain she was doing the right thing. You were doing the right thing, he said. I mean that. There was no version of this where you should have handled it differently. I know, she said. I just need you to know I didn't enjoy it. I know you didn't. He was quiet for a moment. I want to say I'm sorry for what it's cost you, not just the work, the trust, the conversations we've had over the years. A pause. I don't know whether those conversations are still usable. She thought about that, about what Benjamin had said, the person who taught you something real and the person who did something wrong are the same person. Some of them are, she said. The ones that were true are still true. The ones that were about your judgment. She stopped. I'm not sure yet what I do with those. That's fair. I'll figure it out. I'm good at figuring things out. You are, he said. You always have been. They said goodbye with the understanding that this was a pause rather than an ending. Whether the pause resolved into something or simply remained a pause was a question neither of them could answer yet. She hung up and sat at her desk for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Benjamin and said she was coming to Annapolis on Saturday, and she wanted to bring a bottle of wine, and she'd heard there was a good Italian bakery near his house, and she was going to get dessert. Okay, he said. Saturday. Good. How are you? He asked. Better, she said. Working on it. They spent Christmas Eve apart, she, with a college friend in Georgetown, he, with his sister who'd flown in from Portland and texted in the late evening like two people who had established a habit that they weren't trying to break. She texted, "Your sister sounds formidable." His response? She is. She asked about you. She stared at that for a moment. Then, what did you say? That you were formidable too. She seemed satisfied. She put the phone down and smiled at nothing in particular, and then picked up a piece of her friend's excellent homemade pie and ate it, and felt in the easy warmth of the evening the specific temperature of a life that was changing, becoming something different from what it had been, not dramatically, without announcement, in the way that most real changes happened, which was quietly when your attention was elsewhere. New Year's was in a week. She made no resolutions. She'd stopped making resolutions when she was 34, because she had found them in practice to be promises she made to a version of herself that wasn't quite accurate. Instead, she made a list, the private kind in the notebook she kept in the drawer of her bedside table, the one that Renata didn't have access to. She wrote, "What do I want?" She looked at that for a while. Then she wrote because she was a specific and accurate person, and the situation deserved specificity. Work that I can point to. A life with real things in it. to stop treating uncertainty as failure. She thought about adding something else. She looked at the page for a while. Then she wrote Benjamin, just the name. She looked at it for a moment and then closed the notebook. She turned off the light and went to sleep, and outside the Georgetown street was quiet with January almost here. And somewhere in Annapolis, a man who built things and restored things was also presumably asleep in a house with a porch and trees in the yard, thinking about something she hoped was close to what she was thinking about. That January was the wrong month for many things and the right month for others. It was the right month for honesty, Jasper had decided. Something about the cold and the stripped-back trees and the way the year was new enough to still feel provisional, it made things easier to say. She and Benjamin spent the second Saturday of January at his house, where she'd started arriving with food or wine, or both. Not by arrangement, but by common understanding that Saturday had become a kind of given. This particular Saturday, she'd brought groceries for soup, a slow-cook French onion situation she'd been making since her 20s when she'd had more time and a smaller kitchen, and she was standing at his stove in November socks, and the kind of focused attention she brought to most things when he said from the kitchen table where he'd been reading, "Tell me something you've never told anyone professional." She looked at the pot. "That's a strange ask. I'm curious about you, not professionally. You know considerable amounts about me professionally." "Yes. That's why I'm asking for the other part." She stirred the onions. They'd been caramelizing for 25 minutes and needed another 15, which was the thing about French onion soup. It couldn't be rushed without becoming something lesser. "I've spent significant time wondering whether I'm actually good at understanding people or whether I'm good at understanding professional situations, and I've confused the two." He was quiet. "Professionally?" She said, "I read rooms correctly. I know what people want and what they're afraid of and how those two things conflict. In the defense space, in boardrooms, in client relationships." She paused. "But those are professional contexts. Everyone's performing a role. I'm reading the performance." Another pause. "Gerald Foss, 16 years. I didn't see it." "You saw it eventually. I saw a pattern in documents. That's different from seeing a person." She turned and looked at him across the kitchen. He was watching her with the reading glasses she'd seen him wear twice now, which he'd told her were recent and which he wore with the slightly aggrieved expression of someone who'd expected to be exempt from needing them. "I'm not sure I've ever been as good at people as I am at problems." He was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked." "Because I asked," he repeated, not dismissively, thoughtfully. "And because you trust me with it." She turned back to the onions. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I do. Does that feel strange?" She thought about it honestly. "It feels unfamiliar," she said. "Not strange, just unfamiliar enough that I notice it." She heard his chair move. He came and stood beside her at the stove, not touching her, just standing in the shared space of a kitchen in January, and looked at the onions. "For what it's worth," he said, "you've read me accurately. Every time." She looked at him sideways. "Have I? You knew in the first 5 minutes at the garage that something about me didn't fit the obvious frame. You knew at the conference what it meant that I'd chosen not to tell you. You knew at dinner in October that I'd started to trust you before I'd decided to." She was quiet. "So maybe the difference," he said, "is that you're better at people who matter to you. And your professional environment," he paused, "maybe the people there haven't been mattering to you the same way." She looked at the onions for a long time. "That's uncomfortably possible," she said. "Uncomfortable things usually are possible." He picked up the wooden spoon and stirred the onions without being asked, then handed it back to her. "What else? What else? What? Something else you've never told anyone professional." She laughed. Actually laughed the full version, not the precursor. "You're going to make me talk for the whole soup. It's a long cooking soup." She handed him his wine glass from the counter. "I don't think I know how to stop doing what I do," she said. "The work. I don't know what I am without it. Not in a dependent way. I know what I value outside work. Books, music, this." She gestured vaguely at the kitchen, the soup, the January afternoon. "But in the world, in the sense of how I locate myself." She paused. "I've been a project executive for 12 years. Before that, I was building toward becoming one. There hasn't been a version of me that wasn't pointed at something professional. And if you weren't, I don't know." She looked at him. "What are you without hail defense?" He considered. "A man who restores cars and reads too much. and has dinner with someone he likes on Saturdays. A pause. That's not nothing. No, she agreed. It's not. The company is what I've built. It's not what I am. He looked at his wine. It took me a long time to know the difference. I'm not sure I knew it until the hearings, honestly. Until the thing I'd built was under threat and I found out I was still standing. She thought about that. I'm still figuring that out, she said. You're 39, he said. You keep saying that like it's a comfort. It's a fact. Make of it what you want. She made of it what she could, which was to turn the heat down on the onions and lean against the counter and be quiet for a moment in a warm kitchen in January with a man she trusted and soup that needed more time, and find that this felt like something she wanted more of. February arrived with a cold that lasted 2 weeks and a significant win. Whitmore's revised bid package, restructured with Meridian's guidance, stripped of the anomalous elements and submitted through a clean process, was selected for federal contract award. The program was not the largest the industry had seen, but it was large enough that the win changed Whitmore's trajectory, and it validated the 3 months of difficult work that had preceded it. The CEO called Jasper directly to tell her. She accepted the congratulations with the efficiency that was her natural register for professional success, said the right things, and hung up. Then she sat at her desk for a moment and felt the specific satisfaction of seeing a thing that had been made to fail succeed, instead, which was not the emotion of her ordinary wins, but something different, something that had a shape in it, that included alongside the professional satisfaction the memory of Gerald Foss's voice on the phone saying, I knew it wasn't clean when I was doing it. She called Benjamin. Whitmore won, she said. I know, he said. Marcus called. Of course he did. She paused. Are you glad? I'm glad for Whitmore. I'm glad the process worked. A pause. I'm glad you found what you found when you found it. Late still, Jasper. His voice was patient. You found it, that's the fact. She breathed. All right, dinner, Saturdays. Yes. She paused. I'll cook this time. Actually cook, not bring groceries and monopolize your stove. You can monopolize my stove whenever you like. She smiled at her office wall. Saturday, she said. March was when things got difficult. She hadn't anticipated March. She should have, because things that were going well were frequently followed by things that required adjustment, and she knew this professionally and applied it to everything else with variable success. The difficulty started with a profile. A financial trade publication she respected had been working on a long piece about women in defense strategy consulting. Jasper had done the interview in January, a long conversation she'd enjoyed, and had largely forgotten about it, until her publicist, a function she maintained with minimal enthusiasm, but functional awareness, sent her a message saying the piece was running this month. She read it on a Thursday morning. It was accurate and well-written, and the journalist had done her due diligence. In name Meridian, it described the Whitmore situation in general terms, without identifying Gerald Foss, and it included 3 paragraphs about her career trajectory and professional philosophy that were correct in every important detail. It also, in the second-to-last paragraph, named Benjamin, not prominently. A sentence about the Whitmore situation, noting that Jasper had navigated it with the assistance of a source at Hale Defense Technologies, who provided critical intelligence on the access anomaly, accurate anonymous barely there. The problem was that the defense strategy space was not a large world. She knew, before the end of Thursday, that 3 people had reached out to Marcus Webb to ask whether the unnamed source was Benjamin. She knew by Friday morning that 2 members of Hale Defense's board had called Benjamin directly. He told her about those board calls on Friday evening, matter-of-factly, the way he told her most things. They were on the phone. She was in her car in the parking garage at Meridian, engine off, windows fogging slightly in the March cold. What did they say? She asked. They wanted to know whether I'd provided sensitive company information to an outside party in connection with a competitor's situation. And you said, I said I'd assisted in an investigation that had correctly identified a breach of procurement protocol and that no Hale Defense sensitive information had been shared, which is true. She was quiet for a moment. They're worried about conflict of interest. They're worried about the optics of the company being named in a piece about another company's investigation, which is not the same thing as conflict of interest, but in their position, I'd be asking similar questions. He paused. Marcus is managing it. The board will get a briefing on Monday. Will they be satisfied? Yes. The facts support the position. Another pause. There's a second thing. She waited. One of the board members asked whether there was a personal relationship involved in my decision to assist. She stared at the fogged windshield. What did you say? I said I'd be happy to discuss any concerns about conflict of interest in the Monday briefing and that my personal relationships were not relevant to the board's oversight function. She processed that. That's not a no. No, he agreed. It's not, she breathed. Benjamin. I'm not worried about the board. Monday will handle the board. He paused. I'm telling you because you'd find out anyway, and because I'd rather you find out from me in order than have it show up sideways. She was quiet. Is there anything you need me to do? She said. No. His voice was level, not dismissive, just certain. This is my situation to handle. I'm handling it. You handled it in part by helping me. By choosing to help you. There's a difference. He paused. Jasper, this isn't a crisis. It's a Monday board briefing. She breathed again. She looked at the windshield. The fog was making patterns. I don't want to have cost you something, she said. You haven't. Not yet. He was quiet for a moment. I made the decision to help with my eyes open. I knew what the adjacent professional terrain looked like. I made the choice because it was the right thing to do and because you're someone I wanted to do right things alongside. A pause. That's not a cost. That's a choice. She was quiet for a long time. Thank you, she said. Not for Monday, for all of it. Saturday, he said. Saturday, she agreed. She sat in the parking garage for another 5 minutes after they hung up in the cold car with the fogged windows, thinking about what it felt like when someone told you that they'd chosen something with their eyes open and meant it. It felt like something she hadn't known she was waiting for. She started the car and drove home. The Monday after the board meeting, which Jasper knew the result of, and which Benjamin had described to her with characteristic economy on Thursday evening, before her text on Thursday night, she drove to Annapolis without calling first. It was 7 in the morning. The garage wasn't open yet. She sat in the car in the gravel lot for about 90 seconds before she decided that sitting in her car in a parking lot at 7 in the morning was not a behavior she was going to sustain, and she got out and walked to the door and knocked. Carol answered. She looked at Jasper for a moment with the expression of someone who had put together a picture from several separate pieces of information. He's in the back, she said. I'll tell him. She sat in the waiting room. She had not brought anything. Not coffee, not food, not a folder of professional materials. She sat in the plastic chair and waited with the discipline of someone who'd learned patience through professional necessity rather than natural inclination. He appeared in the doorway after 5 minutes. He was in work clothes she'd driven there at 7 in the morning and found him already working, which she should have expected but hadn't, because she'd been thinking about the drive rather than the arrival. He looked at her with the gray-eyed steadiness that she still found after 5 months simultaneously comfortable and destabilizing. I'm sorry, she said. He came in and sat in the other chair. For the text? Yes. She met his eyes. I'd been sitting with the weight of the board situation for 2 weeks, and Thursday I had a difficult day for unrelated reasons, and I made a decision from inside the accumulated weight of it instead of from the clearer place. She paused. That was wrong, and I'm telling you directly, rather than in a text, at a better moment. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you for coming in person, he said. I should have called first. Yes. The corner of his mouth moved. But I've learned your tells. You apologize in person when it matters. She looked at him. Am I that legible? Only to me, he said. And only recently. She breathed. Are we okay? He looked at her steadily. We're going to be. Today is fine. A pause. I'm not going to pretend Thursday didn't happen. That's not how I operate. I know. And I want you to understand that the thing you did, the impulse to make yourself smaller when a situation gets complicated, is something I saw coming. I knew it was a pattern. She was quiet. You're not the only person who does it, he said. I did it after the hearings. I withdrew from everything and called it protecting myself. It was protecting myself, but it was also avoiding the parts of my life that felt like too much. He paused. What I'm saying is that I understand the impulse and I'm not going anywhere because of it. She held his gaze. But I need you to trust me, he said. When I tell you I can handle something, when I tell you that the complicated isn't the same thing as the wrong. I know that. You know it in principle, he said. When it applies to other people. She held that for a moment. I'm working on it applying to me, she said. I know. He reached over and briefly, without ceremony, touched the back of her hand. That's why I'm here. She looked at his hand and then at his face, and at the familiar quality of his morning, the work clothes and the coffee already made, and the garage behind him doing what garages did. She thought about what it cost a person to stay when staying was complicated, and what it said about him that he was in the staying column. "I'm going to make mistakes," she said. "With this. With us. I know. That doesn't bother you. Not as much as it would bother you if I pretended otherwise." He stood. "Come into the bay. I'll show you what I'm doing with the Falcon's ignition system." She followed him into the bay. She didn't know anything about ignition systems. She knew enough by the end of an hour to follow the logic, and that was she'd found exactly enough to sustain a conversation with someone who did know about ignition systems, the threshold of competence that let you ask the right questions. He explained it patiently and precisely, and without the quality of performance that she'd encountered in people who explained things to people who knew less than they did. He explained it because it was interesting, and because she was there, and because the specific pleasure of showing someone something real was not diminished by the fact that she'd arrived at 7 in the morning to apologize. She thought about this on the drive back to D.C. The pleasure of showing someone something real. How rarely she'd experienced that from either direction, being shown something real, showing something real to someone. Her professional relationships had always been strategic in the way that professional relationships were useful, bounded, conducted in the register of mutual benefit. She was 40 in 3 months. She thought about what she was going to do with that fact. The board briefing on Monday produced what Benjamin had predicted it would produce: a resolution, a formal note in the board minutes, and a recommendation that he provide clear internal communication protocols when engaging in industry-adjacent activities that could create reputational adjacency for the company. He told her about it Tuesday. She read the phrase reputational adjacency in his voice and knew from the slight quality he put on the second syllable of adjacency what he thought of the phrase. "What does Marcus think?" she asked. "Marcus thinks it was theater." The board needed to show they'd asked the question. Were they satisfied? Mostly. A pause. "There's one board member who isn't satisfied. Victor Brennan. He's been on the board 6 years, and he's been working to expand board oversight of executive decisions for most of that time. This gave him a structure to work with." She heard something in his voice that she'd learned to identify over the past 5 months. A particular quality of controlled concern, the voice of someone managing a situation rather than reacting to it. "How serious is Brennan?" she asked. "Serious enough to warrant attention. And you're giving it attention." "Marcus is giving it attention. I'm giving Marcus my full backing to give it attention." He paused. "This is how it works. You build something, you put people in charge of it, you trust them to manage what they manage." "You're very calm about this." "I've had a week to process it." Another pause. "Ask me in a month how I feel." She filed this. She filed the tone of it, the specific texture of a competent person who'd been through significant professional difficulty before and had developed the muscle memory of managing it without catastrophizing. She thought about the congressional hearings which he'd managed in exactly this way, with the steadiness of someone who knew the situation was hard and was handling it without becoming the situation. She hoped the month was good to him. The month was not particularly good to anyone. In early April, the Armature Institute released a formal complaint with the Federal Procurement Office, alleging that the process by which Whitmore had been selected for contract award had been compromised by the identification and elimination of a competing party's proprietary intelligence. The complaint was in simple terms an allegation that the investigation Jasper had conducted had not corrected a breach of process, but had itself created one that by using information from Hale Defense's Access audit to identify and report the source of the original breach, she'd involved a competing company in Whitmore's contract process in a way that had influenced the outcome. It was from a certain angle technically arguable. She sat with the complaint for most of a morning before calling Devin, who had it in his inbox already. "How bad is this?" he said when he answered. "Potentially significant. Depends on whether the procurement office takes it up formally." "They will. The Armature Institute has standing and resources." "I know." She looked at the complaint document on her screen. "Devin, who's the Armature Institute's general counsel." "I'll find out." "Find out yesterday." She spent the rest of that day building a timeline. Every step she'd taken, every document she'd produced, every party she'd notified, and in what order. Her evidence was clean. She'd known it would need to be clean when she'd been building it, because that was the kind of situation it was, and she didn't often work without that awareness. But clean evidence required a clean narrative. And the clean narrative required that she be able to explain precisely and in sequence why every decision she'd made was within the bounds of her professional mandate. The hard part was hail defense. The hard part was that the cleanest version of her narrative, the one that most clearly demonstrated that she'd acted correctly, required explaining that she'd received assistance from a company that was not a party to the Whitmore account and that the assistance had been specifically relevant because of a personal relationship. She could explain it correctly. She knew how to explain it correctly. But correctly and without creating additional complexity were two different things. She called Benjamin at 7 that evening. She told him about the complaint. He was quiet for longer than she expected. "Victor Brennan," he said. "What?" "The board member who's been pushing for oversight expansion. He's affiliated with the Armature Institute's advisory committee." A pause. "This is not coincidence." She stared at her desk. "He's using the complaint to put pressure on you through me, or using me to put pressure on the complaint through you. Either way, it's the same structure." He was controlled. "Are you okay?" "I'm functional." She paused. "Are you?" "Marcus is handling the internal aspect. The board will need to convene." A pause. "Brennan will use this to argue that my decision to assist you created liability for the company." "Did it?" He was quiet for a moment. "No. Legally, no. What I did was assist in an industry integrity matter using information that didn't constitute company IP. But Brennan doesn't need to be right. He needs to be loud enough, long enough to change the composition of the conversation." She understood this completely. She'd seen it before. "What does he want?" "He wants an expanded oversight committee with his allies on it. He's been working toward it for 3 years. I've been declining to give it to him because I built this company and I have a board for accountability. And I'm not willing to give any individual board member structural control over executive decisions. That's not a board, that's a court." His voice was very level. "I will not give him that. He'll make this as loud as possible." "Yes, he will." She was quiet. She was thinking about what Brennan's noise would look like from outside the complaint. The board pressure, the suggestion that a personal relationship between a hail defense executive and a defense strategy consultant had influenced a federal procurement decision. She was thinking about what her name would look like in that noise. And she was thinking about what she owed Benjamin not in terms of debt, but in terms of accuracy. "My investigation created the opening he's using," she said. "Your investigation was correct and necessary." "Yes." "And it created the opening." "Yes," he said. "And I knew it was a complicated environment when I decided to help you, and I decided to help you anyway." "I know." "Then what are you trying to say?" She was quiet for a moment. "I'm trying to figure out what I owe you in this situation." "You don't owe me anything in this situation." "Benjamin, you did the right thing." "I did the right thing. A complicated actor is using both right things for leverage." His voice was precise. "This is not a situation created by your debt. This is a situation created by Victor Brennan's ambition and Gerald Foss's bad decision. Those are not your debts." She looked at the complaint document on her screen. "The procurement office is going to want to interview me," she said. "I know. And the narrative will include you." "I know. I can construct the narrative in a way that minimizes your involvement," she said. "The facts support it. I used information from Hail Defense. I didn't receive strategic guidance. I made every decision independently." "That's true." He was quiet for a moment. "Minimizes or obscures?" She closed her eyes briefly. "That's the question." "Yes." He paused. "You don't have to obscure anything. The facts are what they are. Tell the facts." "The facts include a personal relationship." "Yes." "Which didn't influence your professional decisions." "I know that. You know that. What the procurement office will make of it is their determination to make." He paused. "Jasper, I've been through federal hearings. I know what that room feels like. You know what that room feels like. We both know that the facts are the foundation and that the foundation is solid." A pause. "Do not compromise the integrity of your account because you're trying to protect me." She heard what he was saying. She heard it clearly. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "Get some sleep." "You too." She hung up and sat for a long time with the complaint on her screen and the spring night outside the window and the strange texture of doing the right thing and having someone use it against you, which was not a new experience but which never stopped feeling like a particular kind of wrong. But the procurement office interview was in mid-April. She went in with her timeline, her documentation, and the clean narrative she'd been building for 3 weeks. She went in alone, not without counsel. She wasn't a fool, but her attorney waited outside the room because she'd learned years ago that the most effective witness was one who spoke their own language rather than their lawyers. She told the truth in the correct order. She described finding the anomalies of the independent assessments she'd requested from her team, the decision to pursue the access pattern, the engagement of Hale Defense as an industry party with relevant technical knowledge of the adjacent program. She described the relationship with Benjamin Hale as an acquaintance of several months that had developed in the course of the investigation into something more personal. She used that phrase and watched the examiner write it down and described how she had made every professional decision independently and had cross-referenced the relevant ethical protocols before engaging Hale Defense's cooperation. She was in the room for 90 minutes. She came out and her attorney said, "You were clear," and she said yes. And they walked to the parking garage in the April sun, and she called Benjamin and told him it was done. "How was it?" he asked. "Exactly what I expected." She found her car. "They'll have questions for Marcus." "Marcus is prepared." "Good." She unlocked the door and stood in the cool of the parking garage. "Benjamin, the board meeting. Next week? What's your position going in?" He was quiet for a moment. "That the company acted appropriately. That I made a decision within my authority as CEO. That Brennan's complaint is structurally opportunistic, and that I'm prepared to address the governance question directly rather than through manufactured crisis. And if the board doesn't hold," she asked it carefully. She needed to know how he was thinking about it. "The board will hold," he said. "I know this board. I know who Brennan has and doesn't have. And if he has more than you think, then I'll manage what there is to manage." A pause. "I've been through worse." "I know you have." They were quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" "For the complexity. Jasper." His voice was patient and a little impatient. "I told you before. I made a choice with my eyes open. Stop apologizing for the choice I made." She breathed. "It's harder than I expected," she said. "Watching someone deal with something that I'm adjacent to." "Adjacent to," he repeated, and the specific word which echoed the board's phrase from weeks ago landed with a slight irony that was also warm. "That's a terrible phrase," she said. "It's a precise phrase," he said. "You're not responsible for it. You're watching it. There's a difference." A pause. "Which is hard. I know it's hard, but it's the accurate description." She sat in the car. The parking garage was quiet. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he agreed. But she made the decision on a Tuesday evening in late April. She'd been carrying it for most of 2 weeks. The specific weight of a decision that was both clear and difficult, the kind that you couldn't arrive at by reasoning alone, because the reasoning kept circling back to the same place. The place was the current situation in which Benjamin was managing a board threat that had been catalyzed by his connection to her, was complicated by the fact that she was still present in it. Their relationship, which was real, and which she was not going to reduce, was the thing Brennan was using, and as long as the relationship was visible and ongoing, Brennan had the lever. She could not fix what had already happened. The investigation, the complaint, the board meeting that was now 4 days away, none of that was fixable. What she could do was make the next period simpler. She called Benjamin on Tuesday evening. He answered on the second ring. "I think we should take a step back," she said, "until your board situation resolves." A pause, a careful one. "Define step back." "I think—" She stopped. She'd rehearsed this, and the rehearsal wasn't helping. "The connection between us is what Brennan is using. I think that if we're less visible as a connection during the board process, his leverage is weaker." "I see." "I'm not ending anything," she said. "I'm suggesting a pause, a professional separation for a period." He was very quiet. "Benjamin, I'm thinking," he said. She waited. "The board meeting is next Thursday," he said. "Are you suggesting a pause until next Thursday or something longer?" "Until it's resolved, fully resolved. The procurement inquiry, too." "That could be months." "I know." He was quiet again. "Jasper," he said, "the thing you're describing, reducing our visibility to diminish Brennan's leverage, assumes that Brennan's strategy matters enough to govern what we do. His strategy is currently creating real consequences for your company." "Yes. And his strategy will continue to be opportunistic regardless of what you and I do, because the strategy is about governance structure, not about you specifically." A pause. "If I back down from my position because of external pressure, I've taught him something. He'll use it again." "This is different from backing down from your position." "Is it?" He paused. You're asking me to restructure a personal relationship because of professional pressure. In my experience, that's the same category. She was quiet. I don't want you to lose ground at your company because of me, she said. I understand that. His voice was warm and controlled. I also understand that the instinct you're acting on, the one that says if I make myself smaller, the problem gets smaller, is one you'd challenge in anyone else. She looked at her window. The April evening was dark already. That's accurate, she said. I know. It doesn't make the instinct wrong. No, he agreed. It makes it worth examining. A pause. What would you tell one of your clients in this situation? Professional pressure is creating personal complexity. Do you protect the professional situation by limiting the personal one, or do you handle the professional situation on its own terms? She knew the answer. She knew it before he finished the sentence. You handle the professional situation on its own terms, she said. Yes? She breathed. I'm trying to protect you. I know. I'd rather you didn't do it by making yourself disappear. She closed her eyes for a moment. She had been in rooms all her professional life where she'd made herself strategically smaller to serve a larger purpose, where she'd understood that the specific calibration of how much space to take was itself a skill, a professional judgment. She'd been good at it. It had served her. But she was not in a professional room. She was on the phone with a man she'd put in the notebook beside her bed, with his name alone on the line, and he was telling her clearly what he needed, and what he needed was for her to stay. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. But if you're bored, let me manage my board. Benjamin. Jasper. His voice was patient. Trust me with this. She sat in the quiet for a moment. She thought about the specific quality of trusting someone with something rather than trying to manage it yourself. She thought about how unfamiliar this felt, and how familiar it had become in the last 5 months. All right, she said. But she woke up the next morning and the weight was still there. And the day after that. And the day after that. And on Thursday evening, 5 days before the board meeting, after a difficult call with Devin about a separate client matter that had gone sideways, and a conversation with Renata about her schedule that had surfaced 3 conflicts she hadn't caught, and a long March, dark and April evening alone in her Georgetown row house with the weight of everything sitting on her chest, she did the thing she'd decided not to do. She texted him, I need some space. I'm sorry. She put the phone down. She sat with what she'd done for about 20 minutes, which was enough time to know that she'd done it for the wrong reasons and from the wrong place. Not from clarity, not from a decision about what was right, but from the accumulated pressure of a month that had been too much, and an evening that had been specifically too much, and the particular exhaustion of caring about someone's situation while not being able to help with it. She picked up her phone to call him. His response came before she could dial. A single text. Okay, take the time you need. She stared at that. He hadn't argued. He hadn't pushed back. He'd done what she'd asked immediately with the kind of respect for her stated need that told her he meant it and also somehow made it worse. She put the phone down. She went to bed at 9:30 and didn't sleep for 2 hours. And when she finally did sleep, she dreamed about nothing she could remember except that it was warm where she was, and she woke to the cold April dark and the sense of having moved away from something she'd been standing close to. But the board meeting happened without her. She knew it was happening. The date was in her mind with the specific weight of something you're not looking at but are aware of. She worked on Thursday. She had 2 calls and a lunch meeting and a preliminary report on a new client to review, and she worked with the focused efficiency that was her oldest and most reliable coping mechanism. She called Marcus Webb at 4. She didn't know whether this was appropriate. She called him anyway. How did it go? She said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Brennan got one concession, a standing risk review committee quarterly reporting. Nothing structural. She breathed. Benjamin? He held a pause. He was very effective in there. Clear, prepared, not defensive. Another pause. He'll be fine, Ms. Monroe. She said thank you and hung up. She sat in her office and thought about a man who had been clear and prepared and not defensive in a board meeting where his own judgment was being questioned because of a decision he'd made on her behalf. And she thought about what she'd done on Thursday evening 5 days ago and what it had communicated about how much she trusted that judgment. She picked up her phone. She put it down. She looked at the window. The April evening was coming in. She made herself go home. She made herself eat dinner. She sat at the kitchen table in her Georgetown row house with the food she'd cooked and ate it slowly and thought for the first time in a week with something approaching clarity rather than the fog of accumulated pressure. What she thought was she had done to Benjamin exactly the thing she'd identified as wrong when she'd been considering it 5 days ago. She'd made herself smaller because she'd confused protecting him with managing her own anxiety. She dressed it up as strategy and executed it in a moment of exhaustion, and the result was that she'd done something she'd told him she wasn't going to do. She thought about what it meant to not trust someone with something. She had told him she wanted to step back. He had said no, not because he was careless about the professional situation, but because he understood it better than she did, and he had asked her to trust him with it. And she'd said all right, and then 5 days later had done it anyway, quietly, without argument, from a place of accumulated fear. She looked at her dinner. She was not generally a person who was careless with the people she cared about. She was a person who was occasionally careless with her own clarity at the end of a long month. She was also a person who didn't let that stand without addressing it. She picked up her phone. She called. It rang 3 times. Jasper. His voice was neutral. Not cold. His voice was never cold, but careful in a way that told her he'd been managing the week, which was what he did with things. I heard about the board meeting, she said. Marcus. Yes. She paused. I'm glad it held. Thank you. A beat. Is that why you're calling? No. She breathed. I'm calling because what I did on Thursday was wrong. Not wrong as in strategically incorrect. Wrong as in I said I was going to do something, you told me clearly what you needed, I said I understood, and then I did it anyway when I was tired and scared and couldn't think past it. Silence. I know the board is done, she said. I know this call is 5 days late. I know I can't undo the week you had managing this alone. She paused. I'm telling you because I owe you the accuracy of what happened and why. His voice when he finally spoke was quieter. I noticed. I know you did. I also noticed that you didn't do it from calculation. I'm not sure whether that makes it better or worse. Probably neither, she said. It was just fear. I know. He paused. The board is done, you're right, but the procurement inquiry isn't, and there are going to be more difficult periods. I know. What are you going to do differently? She thought about it. The specific precision of the question, not will you do it differently, but what are you going to do was exactly his register. The register of someone who'd been in enough professional difficulty to know that good intentions without a specific mechanism were just feelings with good PR. I'm going to tell you when I'm scared, she said, instead of acting on it before I've thought it through. He was quiet for a moment. That's good, he said. Is that sufficient? She said, not defensively, actually asking. Another quiet. It's a start. A pause. Jasper. Yes. You're not easy, he said. Not in the way people mean that as a criticism. You're someone who processes things by managing them, and when you can't manage something, you manage yourself out of the situation, and that pattern is going to keep showing up. She sat very still. I know, she said. I'm not going anywhere. I'm telling you because you're going to have to be faster than you were this week the next time it happens. She felt something release in her chest. Not dramatically, just the specific easing of something that had been tense for longer than it needed to be. I know, she said again. Come Saturday, he said. Yes. She hung up and sat at her kitchen table with her cold dinner and the spring evening coming in at the window and the specific quality of a thing that had been stretched thin but not broken, which was a different feeling from safety, but might with enough time and enough honesty become something close to it. May was better. The procurement office inquiry produced its finding in the third week Jasper Monroe's engagement of Hale Defense Technologies in the Whitmore investigation had been conducted within the bounds of established industry consultation protocols, and no conflict of interest had been identified. The finding was clear and unambiguous, and the Armature Institute's complaint was formally dismissed. She was in her car when the finding was delivered, pulled over on Wisconsin Avenue where she'd stopped to take a call and had received this one instead. She sat for a moment after reading the document on her phone. Then she called Benjamin. It's done, she said. A pause. How does it read? Clean, fully vindicated. The complaint is dismissed. She heard something in the silence that wasn't nothing. Good, he said. Are you okay? Yes. A pause. Relieved. Another pause. Are you? Yes. She looked at Wisconsin Avenue. The May afternoon was green and warm, and people were walking in the way that May made possible after a long winter. I want to do something to market. I'm not sure what. What do you have in mind? I have no idea. Something that isn't a bottle of champagne and a professional handshake. He was quiet for a moment. Come Saturday and we'll take the Mustang out. She smiled at Wisconsin Avenue. It's yours now. I decided. When? While you were dealing with everything else. It seemed useful to have made a decision about something. She laughed, the full version, the unexpected one. That's either very logical or completely illogical. Probably both. His voice was warm. Saturday, Mustang. We'll find somewhere to go. Yes, she said. We will. She drove home with the windows down and the May air coming in, and the specific feeling of something that was over. Not in the sense of finished, but in the sense of resolved. The way a long passage in a piece of music was over and the next passage began. She drove through Georgetown and thought about the last 8 months, which had started with a car that broke down on Route 9, and a man she'd dismissed as a mechanic and then not dismissed at all. She thought about Beethoven and bid packages and the Armature Institute and Marcus Webb and Gerald Foss and the specific texture of sitting in someone's kitchen while the onions caramelized for longer than expected because the slow version was the one worth making. She thought about the notebook beside her bed with the name alone on the page. She thought about Saturday. The difficulty of April was not only external, she had expected external difficulty. The procurement inquiry, the Brennan situation, the board meeting that she was tracking from a professional distance. What she hadn't fully anticipated was the internal texture of watching someone manage a complicated situation that she was responsible for having caused, even accidentally, even through doing something correct. She called Marcus Webb twice in April. Both calls were brief and professional, and in the guise of clarifying questions about the procurement inquiry timeline. Both calls were also, she knew, motivated by something she couldn't entirely state, which was the need to have an indirect read on how Benjamin was doing. Marcus, who was either perceptive or had been briefed, gave her clean professional answers and volunteered no additional personal information. She respected this and found it frustrating. Devin, who knew most of the professional picture, asked her one afternoon whether she was sleeping. Adequately, she said. That's not a yes. It's an adequate answer to the question. He looked at her across her desk. 7 years of working together gave people a vocabulary they didn't need to use out loud. The inquiry will produce a clean finding, he said. The timeline suggests it. I know. And the board situation is Benjamin's to manage. I know that too. So the thing keeping you up at night is, Devin, he stopped. I appreciate the concern, she said. I'm processing something that isn't fully processable yet. I'll let you know when that changes. He nodded and went back to his office, and she sat at her desk and thought about what she was actually worried about, which required some honesty. She was worried about what the Brennan situation meant for the pattern. The pattern she'd identified in herself, that when things got complicated, she managed the complication by managing herself. She'd told Benjamin she was going to tell him when she was scared. She'd held to that through the early part of April. And then on the worst Thursday of the month, she'd sent a text instead. She was also worried about a larger question she'd been avoiding, which was whether she was good at this. Not professionally, she was good professionally. She'd always been good professionally. But at this, at being in something real with someone, at the specific vulnerability of having made herself legible to a person and then continuing to show up in that legibility rather than retreating into the more comfortable register of strategic distance. She'd been strategic for 20 years. She was very good at strategic. She was less practiced at whatever this required. She drove to the garage on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of April with no appointment and no professional pretext and knocked on the closed bay door because it was a Wednesday evening and the garage was closed. He answered. He was in jeans and a flannel shirt, and he looked like himself in the way that he always looked like himself, which was consistent in a way that she'd come to find specifically stabilizing. I should have called, she said. Yet, he agreed. I came anyway. He looked at her for a moment. Then he held the door open. She came in. The garage was quiet in a different way when it was closed, the compressor off the bays and the low light of the work lamps he'd left on the Falcon visible in the first bay, in its current mid-construction state. He made coffee on the office machine. She sat in the waiting room. He came in with 2 cups and sat. Tell me what's actually wrong, he said. I'm scared, she said. Not about the inquiry. About... She paused. She'd promised him honesty. About whether I know how to do this. Do what specifically? Stay. She looked at her coffee cup. Not leave when it's hard. Not make myself smaller when the situation is complicated. I have a pattern, and I know I have a pattern, and I've been watching myself have the pattern this month and not quite being able to stop it. He was quiet. The text, she said. Thursday. That was the pattern. I know. I'm telling you, I saw it happen, and I couldn't stop it happening. I know that too. He looked at his coffee. You know what that means, right? What? That you saw it. You identified the pattern while you were in it. That's different from not seeing it. She looked at him. Most people who do what you did on Thursday, he said, don't know they're doing it. They have a story that explains why it was reasonable. You don't have a story. He paused. You have clarity and a bad week. That's fixable. She was quiet. I don't want to keep fixing it, she said. After the fact. No. He agreed. You want to fix it before. That takes longer, but you're already partway there. She held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at him across the waiting room in the quiet garage in April. And she thought about what it costs someone to keep saying true things in situations where the easier thing would be to say the comfortable thing. She'd spent a career in rooms full of people who said the comfortable thing. Thank you, she said. You're welcome. He picked up his coffee. You want to see what I'm doing with the Falcon's dashboard? Yes, she said. I do. She followed him into the bay, and he showed her the dashboard restoration, which was more complicated than she'd expected. A weave of original instruments and reproduced bezels and one gauge that was impossible to source, and that he was going to replicate by hand, which he explained as he walked her through it with the patient precision that was his natural register for showing people things. She understood maybe 60% of it. She asked questions about the rest, and he answered them without simplification, which was she had found one of the specific things she valued: the assumption of her intelligence in domains where she was a novice. She drove home at 10 and slept better than she had in 2 weeks. But Victor Brennan's final attempt at leveraging the situation came in the last week of April in the form of a letter to the full board recommending a governance review of Benjamin's decision-making protocols and the creation of a standing oversight committee with majority board member control over executive relationships. Marcus called to tell her about it. He's overplayed, Marcus said. 3 board members who'd been sitting on the fence are now solidly in Benjamin's column because Brennan's letter is transparently political. When does the board meet? Thursday? This Thursday. A pause. Benjamin is prepared. I know he is. She paused. Marcus, is there anything I can do that would help? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Not directly. Your involvement would give Brennan the thing he's been trying to attach to a story about influence and entanglement. A pause. But you could... He stopped. Could what? Nothing. I'm overstepping. You're not. Tell me. A pause. He mentioned a few weeks ago that you'd told him you trusted him with the board situation, and that it had helped. He paused. He's carrying a significant amount right now, Miss Monroe. He doesn't complain about it, but he's been doing this for a year without the full story being in his favor, and it's... Another pause. You know him well enough to know what I mean. She held the phone and looked at her office window. Yes, she said. I know what you mean. She called Benjamin that evening. Thursday, he said when he answered. I know. She paused. I don't have anything professional to add. You're prepared. Marcus is prepared. The board numbers are what they are. Yes, I just wanted to tell you. She stopped. She thought about what she wanted to say with the specific care she'd been applying to things she said to him. I wanted to tell you that I see what you've been carrying this year, in the right order and with the right face for every room. She paused. I see it. He was quiet. That's all, she said. I'll let you get ready for Thursday. Jasper. His voice was different. The controlled quality still there, but something underneath it that was warmer. Thank you. Saturday, she said. Saturday, he agreed. The Mustang handled the way a rebuilt '67 Mustang should handle in May, which was exactly like itself. Not a modern car. Not pretending to be a modern car. Something from an earlier era of engineering when the relationship between a driver and a machine was more physical and less mediated. Benjamin drove. She sat in the passenger seat and watched the Maryland landscape open up around them. Route 50 to Route 400, 4 to roads. She didn't know, moving east toward the shore, the trees going from suburban to agricultural to the specific flatness of the eastern shore with its wide sky and long water views. He didn't say where they were going. She didn't ask. They drove for an hour and 20 minutes, mostly in comfortable quiet, with the windows down and the radio off, and the sound of the engine doing what the engine did. She'd learned by now to identify what she was listening for in it, the specific note that meant everything was correct, the smoothness that was the product of 8 months of careful work. He pulled into a small harbor town she didn't know the name of. Waterfront working docks, a seafood place with weathered shingles and a hand-painted sign, and parked in a gravel lot overlooking the water. "This is where you go," she said. "When I need to think." They got out and walked along the waterfront. It was a Tuesday. She'd taken the afternoon off for the first time in months, which Renata had greeted with the specific silence that meant she was either surprised or carefully refraining from comment, and the harbor was quiet, the working boats out, the pleasure boats in their slips. The May light on the water had a quality that she thought she could have found 100 times in the last 10 years if she'd looked for it and hadn't. "Tell me something," she said. "What kind of something? What you thought when you saw me at the conference, after the garage." He was quiet for a moment, watching the water. "I thought it was going to be complicated." "That's not very poetic." "No." He glanced at her. "I also thought I'd been waiting to see whether you were going to figure it out before it came up professionally. I thought you were going to figure it out." "I might have. In another few weeks. Probably." He looked at the harbor. "I also thought—" He paused. "I thought there was something worth complicating, which is not how I usually think." "Because you usually avoid it." "Because I've found historically that the things worth complicating are rare, worth being careful about." He looked at her. "So, yes, I thought it was going to be complicated, and I thought you were worth it, in approximately that order." She looked at him in the May light at the harbor, at a man who was honest about things in the specific and quiet way of someone who meant it. "I thought you were uncomfortably perceptive," she said. "At the garage, the first time." "Uncomfortable for whom?" "Me." She looked at the water. "Most men who find me interesting are interested in the version of me that's legible from a distance. The professional competence, She paused. "The presentation. You seemed interested in the gap between the presentation and whatever was behind it." "I was. I found that alarming. And now—" She turned and looked at him directly. "Less alarming, which is alarming in a different way." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the precursor that she'd learned was his version. "That's honest." "I try." They walked a little further along the waterfront and found a bench at the end of a short pier and sat. The harbor spread out in front of them, the blue-gray of May water, a working boat making its way back in from whatever it had been doing. "I want to do something different," she said. He waited. "Professionally." She looked at her hands. "The procurement inquiry, the Whitmore situation, all of it. It made me think about what I'm actually doing when I'm doing it right. The useful version of what I do is identifying where systems fail and why. The Whitmore situation wasn't about bid strategy. It was about integrity failures in a system that was supposed to have safeguards. Yes, there are structural reasons those safeguards fail. I know what most of them are." She paused. "I've been advising individual clients on their individual situations, but the underlying failures are systemic." He was quiet, listening in the way he listened without offering her a direction, just holding the space. "I want to build something that addresses the systemic part," she said. "An independent oversight function. Something that's not inside any single company or agency, but that the industry can use. A clearinghouse for integrity issues in defense procurement." "That's a significant undertaking." "I know. You'd need funding, institutional backing, board governance, so." "I know." She looked at him. "Would you sit on the board?" He looked at her for a moment. "You're asking me this now, on a Tuesday afternoon on a dock. You said you'd been waiting to see whether I was going to figure it out." She held his gaze. "I'm figuring something out." He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "I'll sit on the board." She nodded. She looked back at the water. "I'm also done with things I'm doing because they're what I've always done," she said. "Are you talking about Meridian?" "I'm talking about a life I've been building in one direction for 20 years, and the fact that I've spent the last 8 months finding out what it looks like when you're moving in more than one direction." She paused. "I'm not leaving Meridian immediately. I'm not doing anything dramatic. I'm just acknowledging that the version of what I was doing before needs to be different from the version going forward." He was watching her. "That's the most I've ever heard you say about yourself," he said, all at once. "It's a Tuesday afternoon on a dock," she said. It seemed like the right context. He looked at the water. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I've been thinking about what Marcus calls the company's second era. The first era was building it. The second era is deciding what it's for. He paused. The work we did in the early days, the guidance system components, that was technical excellence in the service of a problem. The last several years have been technical excellence in the service of revenue. Those aren't the same thing. No. The thing you're describing, the oversight function, it's the kind of institutional structure that the industry needs, and that nobody inside any existing institution can build because they're all too close to the problem. He looked at her. My company would benefit from this too. Not because of the competitive landscape, because we're inside a system that fails in the ways you're describing, and we know it. You'd have to be a board member with disclosure requirements, conflict management. I know what board governance looks like. She almost smiled. Yes, you do. They sat for a while in the May afternoon. The working boat had made the harbor entrance and was coming in slowly. The light had moved later, now the afternoon becoming something closer to evening. I'm glad you broke down, he said. She looked at him. On Route 9, I'm glad your car broke down outside my garage. She thought about September, the gravel shoulder, the 40 seconds of warning, the way she'd walked down the road in heels that weren't designed for gravel. I don't usually believe in that kind of thing, she said. The meaning of accidents. Neither do I. And yet, he agreed. She looked at the harbor. The boat was in now, easing toward its slip. The captain, visible from here, was moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. I should have come back sooner, she said. For the car inspections, I kept finding reasons. I noticed. Did you wonder why? I assumed you were deciding something. She looked at him sideways. What did you think I was deciding? Whether I was worth the complication. He said it without self-pity, just accurately. You're careful. You don't do things halfway. I assumed you were taking the time you needed to be sure. I was. She paused. I am. He looked at her. I'm sure, she said. Not as a declaration, as a simple statement of fact in the way she stated things when they were true. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the bench between them. They sat like that while the harbor did what harbors did. In May, the water moving the boat, settling the light, doing its slow, late afternoon work on everything it touched. The summer months were the best of what they'd built. She spent them building what she'd described on the dock, the oversight organization that she was calling provisionally the Meridian Integrity Institute, which Renata pointed out sounded like a spa name, and which Jasper kept because she'd found that the names that sounded slightly wrong at first were often the ones that were right. Benjamin sat on the founding board. Marcus Webb consulted on the governance structure. Devin, who'd been with Meridian for 7 years and who deserved something with more scope than what she could give him at the old version of Meridian, agreed to serve as the Institute's first director of operations. She did not leave Meridian immediately. She restructured her role, fewer client accounts, more time on the Institute's foundational work, and had a long conversation with the firm's managing partner about what the next 2 years would look like. The managing partner, who had known her for 12 years and understood what she was doing, said that what she was describing sounded like the right move, and that Meridian would support the Institute's work, and that he'd need a transition plan by September. She gave him a transition plan by September. Whitmore's CEO, when she told him about the Institute, wrote a check large enough that she had to call Benjamin afterward to process the surprise of it. People in the industry know what the problem is, he said. They've been waiting for someone to build the solution. You knew this. I suspected it. A pause. I may have mentioned it to a few people in the last several months. She stared at the phone. You've been talking to people. I've been having conversations. His voice was careful and a little amused. In my capacity as someone who operates in the defense technology space. Benjamin, I didn't promise anyone anything. I described a problem and said that a solution might be coming. She thought about this for a moment. She thought about what it meant that he had been doing this quietly in the background without telling her, and without needing credit for it. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. Because it wasn't mine to announce, he said. It was your idea. I was just making the ground a little more hospitable. She sat in her office with the summer afternoon in the window and thought about the specific texture of someone making the ground hospitable, not fixing things for you, not clearing the path, just quietly, ensuring that the soil was better than it might have been. Thank you, she said. You're welcome. Achi. September came around. A year had passed since the gravel shoulder on Route 9 and the 40-second warning and the walk down the road in the wrong shoes. The Institute had its 501c3 status as of August. It had its founding board, its director of operations, its governance structure, and its first formal intake of integrity concerns from two federal adjacent entities who'd been holding similar issues without a mechanism for reporting. Jasper's role at Meridian was formally restructured. She was now a senior strategic advisor, which meant less of the work that had been filling her calendar for 12 years and more of the work that had been waiting underneath it. She drove to Annapolis on a Saturday in mid-September. The leaves were just starting. The same gold and amber and still green that had been there the first time the September light doing its annual job of making everything specific and present and temporary in the way that only things that were going to change could be. She pulled into the gravel lot at Hale's garage. The overhead door was open. The Falcon was in the second bay, not in the state of dignified disassembly where she'd first seen it. It was close to finished now, the body painted a careful medium blue that she hadn't expected, and which was exactly right. She sat in the car for a moment. A year. She thought about what she'd been when she'd walked down this road in the wrong shoes, competent, contained, successful in all the measurable ways, and carrying in the spaces between the measurements, the accumulating weight of a life she'd been building in one direction for so long, she'd stopped asking whether it was the right direction. She got out. He appeared in the bay doorway before she'd crossed the lot. He'd heard the gravel. He was wiping his hands with a blue rag, always the blue rag. She'd stopped trying to determine whether it was the same one, and looking at her with the steady gray eyes and the expression that was warm without performing warmth. "The Falcon," she said. "You chose blue." "It came from the factory in Rangoon red," he said. "But the car wanted blue." She looked at him. "How do you know what the car wants?" "I've been listening to it for 8 months." He tucked the rag into his pocket. "Come inside." She followed him in. The Mustang was in the first bay. Carol had told her months ago that it was being stored at the garage, which she'd understood was Benjamin's way of keeping it where he could see it. It was exactly as she remembered it, deep red and finished already, a month of regular drives worth of small scratches on the chrome that made it look like what it was, which was a thing that was being used. She walked to it and ran her hand along the hood. "Do you want to take it out?" he asked. She turned. He was standing near the bay door, the September light behind him, in work clothes that were the same work clothes he always wore, and that she'd spent a year watching him inhabit with the specific ease of someone who was exactly himself in everything he put on. "Not today," she said. "I just wanted to see where everything started." He watched her. "A year ago, I walked down this road in shoes I shouldn't have been wearing," she said. "And I sat in this waiting room and drank your coffee and decided whether to believe that a man who listened to Beethoven quartets while doing valve work on a '67 Mustang was who he appeared to be. What did you decide?" "I decided I wasn't sure, but I was interested." She looked at him. "I'm still interested, for the record." He crossed the garage toward her in the quiet way he crossed rooms without announcement, with a directness that was the opposite of performance, and stopped close enough that the distance between them was small. "I heard the Institute got its first formal intakes," he said. "2 last week. Devin is handling the protocols." "Good. I'm going to need you to recuse yourself from anything that's adjacent to Hale Defense." "I know." "And Marcus needs to sign the governance disclosure by October." "He will." She looked up at him. The September light was doing what it did, making everything specific and temporary and present. "I have a meeting with the Whitmore CEO next week," she said. "He wants to be a founding sponsor." "I heard." "You heard because you told him about the Institute." "I heard because Marcus told me." "Benjamin, I may have had lunch with Whitmore's CEO in August." She stared at him. He held her gaze steadily and with the particular quality of someone who is not remotely ashamed of what he's done, but is prepared to negotiate the terms of acknowledgement. She laughed, the full version. In the empty garage with the September light and the Mustang beside them, and a year of everything that had happened, the laugh came up from somewhere and she let it. He was smiling. The full version which she'd seen increasingly in the past several months and which still had the quality of something that didn't happen by accident, which required, like most things he did, that the situation be worth it. "You made the ground more hospitable again," she said. "It's what I do." He put his hand against the side of her face. "When I care about something." She leaned into it just slightly, the familiar weight and warmth of it. "The Institute is going to be difficult," she said. "The first 2 years especially. There will be pushback from entities that don't want oversight. There will be funding gaps. There will be political moments." "I know. I'm telling you because you're on the board and because—" She paused. "Because the last year was complicated and you stayed, and I don't assume that will continue to be easy. Jasper." His voice was patient and warm and exactly his. "I'm still here." "I know." She met his eyes. "I'm still here too." He kissed her in the September light of the garage where everything had started, which was the kind of ending that was actually a beginning, which was, she had learned over the last year, slowly and without fanfare, the best kind. The Meridian Integrity Institute's founding event was held in November in a conference center in D.C. and attended by 47 people who represented a cross-section of the defense industry that no one had managed to put in the same room before. Jasper stood at the podium and said what she'd been building toward saying for the better part of a year, which was that integrity in defense procurement was a structural problem that required a structural solution, and that the solution couldn't come from inside any existing institution because every existing institution had a stake in a particular outcome, and that the institute existed to be the thing that had no stake in anything except the process being clean. She said it clearly and without unnecessary flourish and sat down. Benjamin, in the third row with Marcus beside him, did not applaud with any special emphasis. He simply applauded the way everyone did steadily, and then returned to the specific quality of attention he paid to things he was invested in. She caught his eye once briefly. He gave her the look that wasn't quite a smile, but was better than one. After the event in the hallway outside, while people networked in the way that events like this produce networking, Devin found her and said the first 2 calls were already scheduled for next week. "What kind?" she asked. "One's a reporting concern from a contracting agency. One's a governance question from a defense technology firm." He paused. The second one flagged potential issues with a board member's outside relationships. She looked at Devin. He was looking back at her with the particular expression of someone who understood the texture of the work. "Start with the governance question," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She went to find Benjamin. He was talking to the Whitmore CEO, and a woman she didn't know who turned out to be, when introduced, the former chair of the Armed Services Subcommittee. She stood beside Benjamin and shook hands and listened to the conversation, and was aware in the background of all of it, of the specific feeling of being in the right room. Not because she'd maneuvered there, not because it was strategically optimal, but because she'd built something real, and this was where the real thing had brought her. The scholarship program started the following spring. She'd been thinking about it since the summer, when Benjamin had mentioned in passing that Hale Defense's internship program had a notable gender gap in its engineering track, and that he'd been looking at ways to address it and hadn't found a structure he liked. She'd told him she knew what structure she'd build. They'd talked about it over 3 subsequent dinners and a long Saturday afternoon at his house, and the outcome was a joint initiative between the Meridian Integrity Institute and Hale Defense Technologies to fund graduate-level scholarships in systems engineering and defense technology for women who were mid-career and returning to technical fields after life interruptions. Not entry-level, mid-career. The acknowledgement that the gap wasn't only at the beginning. The scholarship fund raised its initial capitalization in 6 weeks. Benjamin explained this by saying the donors were people who understood what a well-structured opportunity looked like. Jasper explained this by saying that the people who needed to fund it had daughters. Both were probably true.
But
She went to the garage in December, a year and 3 months after the car had broken down on Route 9. The Falcon was done. It was in the first bay now, the Mustang having been moved to Benjamin's garage at the house he'd built a proper structure for it, which had been, she suspected, the point of keeping it somewhere else for so long. The Falcon was blue and finished and exactly right in the way that the Mustang had been exactly right, the product of a specific kind of patience, the willingness to do the work for as long as it needed to take. He came out when he heard the gravel, as he always did. She got out of the car. The December air was cold and bright. "You don't have anything wrong with the car," he said. "No." "You came anyway." "Yes." She looked at the garage. Carol's desk visible through the window, a new car, half visible in the second bay. She didn't know the make yet. The familiar smell of oil and metal and clean concrete. It seemed right. He watched her for a moment. "Come inside," he said. She followed him in. The coffee was on Carol. Made it before she left. Now knowing Jasper's visits, which were no longer tied to the car's needs. She poured a cup and sat in the chair in the waiting room, the chair she'd sat in the first day, and looked through the window at the Falcon in the December light. He sat in the other chair. They were quiet in his way they were quiet, which was comfortable and complete and without obligation. "What's next?" he asked. Not about the institute or the scholarship or the professional calendar. She heard the other question in it. She thought about it. "I don't know exactly," she said, which is the first time in 20 years I've been able to say that and have it feel like information, rather than a failure. He looked at her. I know what I'm building, she said. I know what matters to me. I know. She paused. She looked at him. I know who I want to figure it out with. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair between them. That's a good answer, he said. Outside the garage, the December light was doing what December light did, moving across the gravel lot, hitting the signage that had once been red and was now comfortable pink, finding the windows of the bay, where a 1964 Falcon Sprint coupe sat in its finished blue perfection, waiting for wherever it was going to go next. She held his hand in the warm garage and let the December be what it was. A year, a beginning. Everything she hadn't known she was driving toward the day the car gave her 40 seconds of warning on Route 9, and she'd pulled off to the side of the road and walked toward a sign she couldn't read yet. The Institute's first year produced 3 formal findings. The first was the simplest a documentation protocol failure at a mid-sized defense contractor that had allowed a bidding anomaly to persist undetected for 18 months. The finding recommended 2 corrective actions and was accepted by the contractor without contest. Devin called it a proof of concept. The second was more complicated, a series of related access irregularities across 4 separate procurement processes that, when mapped against each other, suggested a pattern of coordinated information sharing between 3 competing firms. The finding was referred to the Federal Procurement Office for formal investigation. The third was the one Jasper hadn't expected. It came in July, a year and change into the Institute's work. A mid-level contracting officer at a federal agency filed an intake form. The anonymous reporting mechanism Devin had built into the system, modeled on the best practices of similar programs in financial oversight, describing a systematic suppression of internal concerns by a supervisory chain that had a financial relationship with the contractor. The concerns were about. The intake form was thorough, specific, and well-documented. The contracting officer had clearly been holding this information for some time and had chosen the Institute precisely because it was outside the existing agency structure. She read the intake form twice. Then she called Devin into her office and closed the door. "What's our exposure here?" she said. "The agency will push back. Hard. This implicates people at the GS-15 and SES levels." "I know." She looked at the intake form. "What's our process?" "We have the independent review mechanism. We engage 3 outside reviewers, no agency connections, and they assess the documentation." Devin paused. "But Jasper, if we move on this, we're going to be in rooms that make the Brennan situation look like a scheduling conflict." "I know." He looked at her across the desk. "Are we doing this?" She thought about the contracting officer who'd filled in the form. She thought about the careful documentation, the 18 months of holding a concern with nowhere to bring it. She thought about what the Institute was for not the theoretical version, but the operational version, the one that was either useful when it was uncomfortable or wasn't useful at all. "Yes," she said. "We're doing this. Get the reviewers." She told Benjamin that evening. They were at his house. It was a Thursday. She was there more than she wasn't on Thursdays, and she walked him through the intake form over dinner, not the full documentation, but the shape of it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "This is what you built it for." "Yes, it's going to be uncomfortable." "I know." "The agency will look for ways to undermine the finding. They'll examine the Institute's governance, our board compositions, our—" "Benjamin," she met his eyes. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The board should be briefed before you move. I'm calling the board chair tomorrow." "Good." He paused. "Should I be on that call?" "You should recuse yourself from anything that touches the federal agency in question, which is why I'm asking whether I should be on the call." She looked at him. He was asking her to make the governance call, which was her domain. He was also asking because he wanted to help and wanted to know what helping looked like. "Recuse yourself from the substantive discussion," she said. "You can be on the call for the governance update portion. I'll flag the transition point." He nodded. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For asking instead of deciding." He looked at her with something in his expression that was warm and slightly amused. "I'm still learning the governance structure." "You're very good at it." "I had a good person explain it to me." He stood to clear the dishes. "Also, I know how to follow rules when the rules make sense." She looked at his profile in the kitchen light. 46 years old, grayer at the temples than he'd been the September she'd walked into his garage running a billion-dollar company and sitting on her board and making dinner on Thursday nights and asking instead of deciding. She thought about the 40 seconds of warning on Route 9. The specific luck of being a person whose car broke down in exactly the right place. She didn't believe in that kind of luck as a rule. She believed in it now. The federal agency intake produced the most significant finding of the Institute's first year, formally issued in September. 2 supervisory officials were removed from their positions. A corrective action plan was implemented. The contracting officer who'd filed the intake form was not identified the anonymous reporting mechanism, held and received a formal commendation through a separate channel. Devin handled the press inquiry with exactly the right amount of information and exactly the right amount of nothing. Jasper was in a conference room in D.C. when the finding was released, and she was doing something entirely different. A consultation for a new client that Devin had taken on in her reduced meridian capacity, and she read the release on her phone between agenda items. She texted Benjamin, "It's out." His response a minute later, "Saw it." Devin handled it well. "He did." A pause. "Then dinner tonight." She looked at the text and felt in the middle of a conference room in D.C. at 11 in the morning the specific warmth of a thing that had become a given. Not dependence, a constant. The way certain things you'd built well became structural rather than decorative. "Yes," she typed. "I'll bring the wine." She put the phone away and turned back to the agenda.
What?
They drove the Mustang to the coast in October. This had been her idea. She'd said one Saturday in late September that they hadn't taken it on a long drive since May, and that October on the eastern shore was not something you wasted. He'd said he'd get the car out on Tuesday. She'd rearranged her schedule. The day was clear and cool and gold. She drove the first hour he let her drive it now, which had happened without announcement sometime in the summer, and the car felt the same as it always had, which was exactly like itself, which was the best thing a thing could be. He drove the second hour. She sat in the passenger seat with the window cracked and the cold autumn air coming in and watched the landscape do what October landscapes did. They went to the same harbor town as May. Different season, the boats were being winterized, the tourist infrastructure closing down the town, returning to itself after the summer. The seafood place was still open. They ate chowder and bread, and she had coffee, and he had tea, which she'd learned he preferred in the afternoon. One of the small, accurate things she'd accumulated over the past year. "Tell me something you haven't told anyone," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You asked me the same thing in January," she said. "Turn." He looked at the harbor. Thought. "When we almost lost the company," he said. "After the hearings. When 3 contracts were gone and we were trying to figure out how to survive. There was a period of about 3 months where I wasn't sure we would. I didn't know it was that close. Nobody did. I didn't tell Marcus until later. I didn't tell the board." He paused. "I went to the garage, and I just bought it. I was a few months in. I spent 3 straight Saturdays working on a 56 Thunderbird that I had no business taking on given everything else, and I processed the possibility that I'd built something and it was going to end." She watched him. "And she said, "and I decided that if it ended, I'd built it anyway, that the ending didn't change what it had been." He paused. "And then I went back to the company on Monday and did what needed to be done, and it didn't end." She looked at the harbor. "That's the thing I couldn't have done at 35, she said, accepting the possibility of the ending before knowing the outcome. "Probably not. I couldn't either until I had to. What changed us?" He thought about it. The hearings, losing the contracts, being publicly associated with a failure that wasn't mine, and having no immediate mechanism to correct the record. He paused. "When the worst thing you've been afraid of actually happens, it changes your relationship with the fear." She understood this. Not from the same experience, her worst fears were still theoretical, still waiting, but she understood the logic. She understood it increasingly over the past year as she'd watched herself move through a complicated situation without retreating, and had discovered that the thing she'd been afraid of, which was the complications getting worse than she could manage, had gotten worse than she'd managed. "I think I'm starting to understand that," she said. He looked at her. "Just starting. I'm a work in progress." She looked at the harbor. "You've known this about yourself for years. I'm newer to it." "You're newer to letting yourself know it," he said. "Different thing." She considered this. "You have this habit," she said, "of reframing things I say as more accurate versions of themselves. Is that a complaint?" "No." She looked at him. "It's something I'm going to do worse than you do for a while and then get better at." He made a quiet sound that was the closest he got to a laugh without the full commitment. "That sounds right," he said. She looked at the October harbor and the boats winterizing and the low gold light and thought about what it meant to be in the right place at the right time in life. Not the planned place, not the place she'd been building toward with 20 years of professional efficiency, but the unexpected place that had turned out to be the real one. She thought about Route 9 in 40 seconds and a walk in the wrong shoes. She reached over and held his hand, and they sat with the October doing what October did, being specific and temporary and present, and she let herself be in it without managing it. That was the main thing she was learning, to be in it,